Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 6 deeply disturbing true Halloween horror stories that will make anyone reconsider what October 31st truly awakens. These are not campfire tales or internet creepypasta, but documented encounters with forces that emerge when the veil between worlds grows thin. Each account has been meticulously compiled from police reports, witness testimonies, historical records, and first-hand survivor statements. From cursed Victorian costumes that possess their wearers to secret rural cults performing harvest rituals. From radio broadcasts originating from impossible frequencies to children who vanish into houses that should not exist. These stories reveal that Halloween horror extends far beyond plastic masks and fake blood. The evidence speaks for itself, and what happened to these 6 individuals cannot be explained by coincidence or imagination. If you appreciate thoroughly researched horror content that exposes the darkness lurking behind our most celebrated holiday, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the unexplained. After listening to these chilling accounts, share your own Halloween encounters in the comments below. We read every response, and some of your stories may be featured in future episodes. Now turn off the lights, lock your doors, and prepare yourself as we uncover the 6 most disturbing true Halloween horror stories ever documented. Patricia had been collecting vintage Halloween decorations for close to 15 years. Not the mass-produced plastic stuff from big box stores, but the real deal from estate sales, antique shops, and online auctions. Her basement was filled with papier-mâché jack-o'-lanterns from the 1920s, tin noisemakers, crepe paper garlands, and German die-cut decorations that most people had never even heard of. She could identify the era of a Halloween postcard just by the printing style. She knew which manufacturers produced the most sought-after celluloid pieces, and she had connections with other collectors across the country who would alert her when something special hit the market. Her husband thought the hobby was eccentric but harmless. Her friends admired her curated displays every October, and Patricia herself felt a deep satisfaction in preserving pieces of history that would otherwise crumble in forgotten attics or end up in landfills. It was mid-September when Patricia walked into an estate sale in a town she had never visited before, about 40 minutes from her home. The house itself looked like it had not been updated since the 1960s, and when she asked the estate coordinator about Halloween items, the woman led her down into a basement that smelled of mildew and old cardboard. The concrete walls were lined with metal shelving units packed with boxes, and the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across everything. Patricia began sorting through boxes methodically, finding the usual assortment of modern decorations mixed with a few interesting pieces from the 1950s. And then the coordinator said something that made Patricia's pulse quicken. There was one more item, hanging in the back corner near the furnace. When Patricia saw the costume, she stopped breathing for a moment. It was hanging from a rusted pipe, and even in the dim light, she could see it was extraordinary. The fabric was aged silk, hand-stitched with seams so fine they must have been sewn by someone with incredible skill. The color pattern consisted of faded red and black diamonds, the classic Harlequin design, but the dye had aged into shades that no modern manufacturer could replicate. The pants and shirt were one piece, a full bodysuit that looked like it would fit someone around 5 feet 8 inches tall. Attached to the costume was a separate collar with 3 small bells, tarnished but intact. But it was the mask that truly captured Patricia's attention. The mask was porcelain, not plastic or rubber or papier-mâché, but actual glazed porcelain. It was cracked along the left side, a fracture that ran from the temple down to the jaw, but the damage only added to its character. The face was painted in the style of a classical clown, white base with exaggerated red lips and black diamonds around the eyes. But something about the expression was wrong. The smile was too wide, stretching almost to where the ears would be. The eyes were asymmetrical, one slightly higher than the other, giving the face a look of perpetual confusion or perhaps malice. And the eye holes were oddly placed, not quite where a person's actual eyes would align, as if the mask had been designed for someone whose face was not quite human in proportion. Patricia asked the coordinator about the costume's history. The woman shrugged and said the previous owner had no family, had lived alone in this house for decades, and had died 3 months ago at the age of 87. Most of his possessions were junk, she explained. But she had been instructed to sell everything. When Patricia asked how much for the costume, the coordinator barely glanced at it before saying $40. Patricia tried not to show her excitement. A costume of this age and quality, particularly with a porcelain mask, should have been worth at least $500 to the right collector. She paid in cash immediately. As Patricia carried the costume up the basement stairs, she felt an odd sensation, like the air pressure had changed. The estate coordinator watched her leave with an expression that Patricia could not quite read. Relief, perhaps, or maybe concern. Patricia loaded the costume carefully into her car, laying it across the back seat, and started the drive home. 3 times during that drive, she glanced in her rearview mirror and felt certain the costume had shifted position. But that was impossible. She had laid it flat. There was no way it could have moved on its own. At home, Patricia brought the costume down to her collection room, a finished section of the basement where she kept her most valuable pieces in a climate-controlled environment. She had a dressmaker's mannequin in the corner, and she carefully dressed it in the costume. The fabric slid over the mannequin easily, almost too easily, as if the costume wanted to be worn. Patricia adjusted the collar, positioned the mask, and stepped back to admire her acquisition. Even on the lifeless mannequin, the costume had a presence. It dominated the room. Patricia's husband came down to see what she had found, took one look at the costumed figure, and went pale. He told her it gave him the creeps. He told her there was something wrong with it. He told her she should get rid of it. Patricia laughed and accused him of being superstitious. But after he left, she stood alone in the collection room and felt, for just a moment, like the mask was watching her. She dismissed the feeling and went upstairs. Over the next 2 weeks, small things happened. Patricia would arrange the costume in a certain position, with the arms at specific angles, and return later to find the arms had moved. She would adjust the tilt of the mask, centering it on the mannequin's head, and come back to find it rotated slightly to the left, as if the figure were looking toward the door. The room temperature, which Patricia carefully monitored to protect her collection, would drop by 5 or 6 degrees whenever she spent time near the costume. Her cat, who normally loved exploring the basement, refused to enter the collection room. The animal would sit at the doorway, fur raised, hissing at something Patricia could not see. Patricia rationalized each incident. The house settled, causing vibrations that shifted the mannequin. The temperature fluctuation was probably a problem with the HVAC system. The cat was reacting to some smell in the old fabric. But the rationalizations became harder to maintain when Patricia started having dreams. In the dreams, she was watching herself sleep. But the perspective was wrong. She was viewing her own sleeping form from across the room, from about 6 feet off the ground, and she could not move. She could only watch. And in these dreams, she heard a voice, thin and reedy, like wind through a crack, whispering in a language she did not recognize. Halloween was approaching, and Patricia's friend was hosting an adult costume party with a vintage horror theme. Patricia immediately thought of the clown costume. It would be perfect. It would be the most authentic piece at the party, and she relished the thought of explaining its history to other guests. When she mentioned the idea to her husband, he objected immediately. He told her there was something wrong with that thing. He told her he was serious, that she should not wear it. Patricia felt a flash of irritation. She had paid for the costume. She had every right to wear it. And besides, it was just fabric and porcelain. There was nothing to be afraid of. On Halloween night, Patricia laid the costume out on her bed. Up close, she noticed details she had missed before. There were stains on the gloves, old stains that had faded to a brownish yellow. The fingertips were especially stained, and when Patricia looked closer, she realized the leather had been worn thin in those spots, as if whoever had worn the costume had clawed at something repeatedly. She pushed the thought away and began to undress. The moment Patricia pulled the costume on, something felt different. The fabric was cold against her skin despite the heated house. It fit perfectly, as if it had been tailored specifically for her body, which should have been impossible given that it was at least a century old and made for someone else. When she zipped up the back, she felt the material constrict slightly, hugging her form. She pulled on the gloves, and they sealed around her wrists tightly. Finally, she lifted the porcelain mask and positioned it over her face. The mask should not have fit. The eye holes were in the wrong place. But as Patricia held it against her face, the porcelain seemed to warm and soften, conforming to her features. She felt the inside of the mask pressing against her skin, and for a moment, she could not breathe. Then the sensation passed, and when she opened her eyes, she could see perfectly through the misaligned eye holes. She walked to the full-length mirror in her bedroom. For just a second, maybe less, she saw someone else staring back. Not a reflection wearing a costume, but someone else entirely. An older man with hollow eyes and a smile that was not a smile at all. His face was gaunt, his skin the color of old paper, and he was looking at her with an expression of recognition. Then Patricia blinked, and it was just her reflection again, dressed in the costume. Her husband appeared in the doorway and stopped dead. He went pale. He told her that her eyes looked wrong. Patricia turned to face him and asked what he meant. He stammered something about the light, about the angle. But he would not make eye contact with her. He told her one more time that she should not wear the costume. Patricia felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sudden. She heard herself tell him to stop being ridiculous, but the voice that came from behind the mask sounded not quite like hers. It was her voice, but flatter, colder. Her husband left the room without another word. Patricia grabbed her car keys and drove to the party. During the drive, she felt strange. Her hands on the steering wheel looked wrong, the gloved fingers too long, the angle of her wrists unusual. She caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror and saw the mask staring back. That too wide smile, those asymmetrical eyes. And for a moment, she felt like she was not driving. Like she was a passenger in her own body, watching someone else control her movements. At the party, Patricia's friends gathered around to admire her costume. They complimented the craftsmanship, the authenticity, the attention to detail. But Patricia noticed that no one stood too close to her. No one touched the costume, even when she offered to let them feel the fabric. And several people commented that the costume was too realistic, that it was honestly creeping them out. Patricia heard herself laughing, but the sound was wrong, too high-pitched, lasting too long. She found herself standing in corners, motionless, watching the other guests. She did not remember walking to these spots. She would suddenly become aware that she had been standing perfectly still for several minutes, staring at someone across the room. One friend asked if she was doing method acting, staying in character as a creepy clown. Patricia did not remember deciding to do that. The party host had 2 children, a boy and a girl, ages 7 and 9. They were supposed to be in bed, but they had snuck out to watch the adults from the top of the stairs. Patricia became aware of them watching her. She turned her head, and the children's eyes went wide. Then Patricia found herself walking toward the staircase. She did not decide to walk. Her legs simply moved. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the children, and she could not move or speak. She was trapped inside her own body, watching through the mask's eye holes, as something else controlled her. The children's mother called Patricia's name 3 times before Patricia could respond. When she finally turned around, the host went pale. Later, the host would tell other guests that it was like Patricia was not in there anymore. That whoever was looking through that mask, it was not her friend. Another guest, a man dressed as a vampire, made a joke about clowns being scarier than vampires. Patricia's head snapped toward him, the movement too fast, the angle wrong. Several people gasped. Patricia felt her body moving toward the man, but she could not stop it. She could not scream or call for help. She was watching from somewhere deep inside her own head as her gloved hands reached for the man's throat. The hands closed around his neck, squeezing. The man's eyes bulged. He clawed at Patricia's wrists, but the grip did not loosen. It took 4 people to pull her off him. They dragged her back, and Patricia felt her body thrashing with a strength that was not hers. The man collapsed, gasping, and when he looked up, there were bruises forming on his neck, dark purple marks in the shape of handprints. But when the host took a photo to document the assault, they noticed something disturbing. The finger proportions in the bruises were wrong. Too long, too thin, not matching Patricia's hands at all. During the attack, Patricia had been speaking. The other guests heard her voice, but the words were not English. One guest, who taught linguistics at the local college, later said the language sounded like corrupted Latin, mixed with something older. And several guests reported hearing Patricia say things in voices that were not hers. One woman swore she heard Patricia speak in her dead mother's voice, using a pet name that no one else could have known. Inside the mask, Patricia was screaming. She could see everything happening. She could feel her hands squeezing the man's throat, but she could not stop. And worse, she could hear a voice whispering instructions to her body. The voice came from the mask itself, vibrating against her skull. It was telling her body where to squeeze, how much pressure to apply, when to twist. The voice was delighted. It had not touched living flesh in so very long. Patricia's husband arrived 20 minutes later after receiving frantic calls from the host. He found Patricia collapsed on the living room floor, twitching, the costume still on. Other guests had backed away from her, forming a wide circle. Patricia's husband knelt beside her and tried to remove the mask. It would not come off. His fingers could not find a seam or edge. The porcelain had sealed itself to Patricia's face, the inside somehow fused to her skin. He had to physically pry it off, wedging his fingers under the edge and pulling with all his strength. Patricia screamed as the mask came away, and the sound was not one voice, but 2, overlapping. When the mask finally tore free, Patricia vomited and collapsed. She woke up in her husband's car, being driven home. She had no memory of the last hour. Her husband told her what she had done, and Patricia began to cry. When they got home and she looked in the mirror, she saw that the skin on her face, everywhere the mask had touched, was covered in raised welts. Red and angry, the welts formed patterns. Her husband took photos, and when they showed them to a friend who studied history, the friend identified the patterns as names and dates. Names in Old German script, dates from the 1890s. The costume was still at the party, collapsed in a heap where it had fallen when Patricia's husband removed the mask. The host called the next day and said something disturbing had happened. After everyone left and she was cleaning up, she had seen the costume move. Not a lot. Just a slight shifting, like something crawling out of the fabric from the inside. Patricia became obsessed with learning the costume's history. She contacted the estate sale coordinator and got the address of the property. She researched the previous owner, a recluse named Harold Wickham, who had died alone at 87. But property records showed that the house had been in the Wickham family for over a century. The original owner was Thomas Wickham, who had purchased the property in 1891. Patricia found a reference to Thomas Wickham in a local historical society archive. He had been a traveling circus performer, specifically a clown, known for an act that disturbed audiences even in that era. Newspaper clippings from 1893 described Wickham's performances. He would enter the stage in his costume and mask, and over the course of the act, his personality would completely change. He would become violent, aggressive, attacking members of the audience. Several people were seriously injured at his shows. After one performance, a child died under mysterious circumstances. The child had volunteered to join Wickham on stage, and during the act, the child collapsed. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but witnesses claimed Wickham had touched the child's face, and the child had simply stopped breathing. Thomas Wickham disappeared after that final show. No records existed of his death or burial, but the costume remained. It passed through the Wickham family for generations, and Patricia found records of 3 other deaths connected to it, all on Halloween, all involving people who had worn the costume. Patricia and her husband tried to destroy it. They attempted to burn the costume in their backyard fire pit. Patricia doused it with lighter fluid and dropped a match on it. The fabric would not ignite. The flame touched the costume and simply went out. They tried cutting the costume apart with scissors. The blades would not penetrate the fabric. Patricia's husband used a heavy knife. The blade snapped. He took the costume to his workplace, where he had access to an industrial shredder. He fed the costume into the machine. The shredder jammed, sparked, and shut down. When he pulled the costume out, it was intact, not even a loose thread. They decided to bury it. They drove to a remote section of forest, dug a hole 6 feet deep, and dropped the costume in. They filled the hole, packed the dirt, covered it with leaves, and drove away. 3 days later, Patricia went into her garage to get gardening supplies. The costume was hanging from a rafter, the mask turned toward the door, as if it had been waiting for her. Patricia filed a police report, claiming someone had broken into their property and left the costume as a threat. The police found no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the yard, no disturbance of the soil where Patricia claimed she had buried it. They dismissed it as a prank or a mistake, suggesting that Patricia had never actually buried the costume and was misremembering due to stress. Now, the costume sits locked in a fireproof safe in a climate-controlled storage unit 20 miles from Patricia's home. She pays for the unit monthly. She has not opened the safe since the day she put the costume inside. But Patricia still has nightmares. In the dreams, she sees through the mask's eyes. She watches herself sleeping. She watches her husband sleeping. She watches her children sleeping. and the view is from inside her house, moving from room to room, even though the costume is locked in a safe 20 miles away. The scars on Patricia's face have faded but never completely disappeared. Thin white lines form a pattern that dermatologists cannot explain. The pattern shifts slightly over time, the lines rearranging themselves into different configurations. On Halloween nights, the scars burn. And on Halloween nights, Patricia sees him in mirrors. Thomas Wickham, standing behind her, still wearing that smile, still wearing that costume, waiting. Patricia knows that one day, he will want the costume back. One day, he will want her to put it on again. And the most terrifying part, the part that keeps her awake more than anything else, is that some small piece of Patricia, some dark corner that the costume awakened, wants to wear it again too. She remembers the feeling of not being in control. She remembers the strength that flowed through her body. She remembers the voice whispering instructions, and in her weakest moments, she misses it. Detective James had worked missing persons for the county sheriff's department for 12 years, and Halloween was always the worst night of the year for calls. Parents panicked when kids were 5 minutes late, teenagers ran off to parties without telling anyone, and the sheer number of people in costumes made finding anyone nearly impossible. Most calls resolved within an hour. A child had wandered to a friend's house. A teenager had turned off their phone. By midnight, the panic subsided and families reunited. But the call that came in at 9:47 p.m. on October 31st was different. The mother's voice on the recording was not panicked. It was hollow. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. The house took her. The house on Blackwood Lane took my daughter. James arrived at the scene within 15 minutes. Blackwood Lane was a quiet cul-de-sac in one of the older neighborhoods, where houses sat on large lots with mature trees. The missing child was Emma Patterson, age 8, last seen trick-or-treating with her older brother Ryan, age 12. According to Ryan's statement, they had been working their way down the street together. Emma had run ahead to the last house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Ryan had stopped to adjust his costume. When he looked up, maybe 10 seconds later, Emma was gone. He had called her name, checked the yard, knocked on the door of the house she had been approaching. No one answered. No one had seen her. James walked the route Ryan described, measuring distances, checking sight lines. The house at the end of Blackwood Lane was a Victorian structure, well maintained, painted a dark blue that looked almost black in the streetlights. The Halloween decorations were elaborate. Fake cobwebs covered the porch. Animatronic figures moved in the windows. A fog machine created a low mist across the front lawn. But something about the display felt wrong to James. It was not scary in a fun way. It looked more like a monument to something. Like whoever had decorated was not celebrating Halloween, but worshiping it. The porch light was on. Through the front window, James could see a bowl of full-size candy bars sitting on a table. Someone was home. James knocked. A man in his late 60s opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. He introduced himself as Robert Marsh. He was cooperative, almost aggressively helpful. He invited James inside before James even asked. He offered to let officers search the entire property. He seemed calm in a way that struck James as odd. A child had vanished from in front of his house, and Robert Marsh acted like he had been expecting this exact situation. James and 2 other officers searched the house from top to bottom. The first floor was neat and orderly. Furniture from the 1970s, clean but outdated. The second floor had 3 bedrooms, all empty of people. The basement was finished, with wood paneling and old carpeting. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of a child. No signs of a struggle. The backyard was clear. The detached garage contained only a car and garden tools. Emma Patterson was not on the property. Robert Marsh's alibi was airtight. He had been on his front porch handing out candy from 6 o'clock until James arrived. He had a witness log, an actual notebook where he had been recording how many trick-or-treaters came by and what time. Dozens of parents and children had seen him. He had not left his porch for more than a minute or two at a time, just long enough to refill the candy bowl. There was no window of opportunity for him to have taken Emma. But something about the man made James's skin crawl. Not evidence, instinct. The way Marsh kept smiling while they searched for a missing child. The way his eyes followed James like he knew something James did not. James returned to the station and began running standard database searches on the address. What came back made his blood run cold. The system flagged Blackwood Lane for 3 previous missing children reports spanning 30 years. In 1995, a 7-year-old boy named Christopher Dunn vanished 3 houses down from Marsh's property. In 2003, a 9-year-old girl named Sophie Chen disappeared from a yard across the street. In 2011, an 8-year-old boy named Marcus Webb was last seen on the same block. All 3 disappearances occurred on Halloween night. None of the children were ever found. All 3 cases remained open and unsolved. James pulled the case files and spread them across his desk. The similarities were striking. All 3 children had been with siblings or friends when they vanished. All 3 disappeared in a matter of seconds when their companion looked away. All 3 were described by parents as trusting, friendly children who would approach strangers without fear. And all 3 vanished within a 200-yard radius of Robert Marsh's house. James checked property records. Robert Marsh had purchased the house in 1988. He had been living there during all 4 disappearances, including Emma's. James returned to Marsh's house the next day with his partner, Detective Sarah Chen. They asked Marsh about the previous cases. Marsh admitted he remembered them. Terrible tragedies, he said. He had almost moved because of the memories. But the house was his home. He had every right to stay. When James pointed out the pattern, 4 children in 32 years, all on Halloween, all within sight of his house, Marsh's expression did not change. He said it was a coincidence. The neighborhood had a lot of children. Statistically, more incidents would occur in areas with higher child populations. James asked where Marsh had been during each previous disappearance. Marsh smiled. "Right here," he said, handing out candy. Just like last night. Dozens of witnesses every time. James could check, and James did check. For each Halloween when a child vanished, neighbors confirmed seeing Robert Marsh on his front porch for hours, never leaving, always visible. The man had a perfect alibi for every single incident. James could not let it go. His lieutenant warned him about becoming obsessed, but James pulled all 4 cold case files and took them home. He studied them late into the night while his wife slept. He created timelines, mapped locations, analyzed patterns. He contacted the original investigators on the older cases. 2 were retired. 1 was dead. The retired detectives both said the same thing. They had suspected Marsh but could never prove anything. There was no evidence, no probable cause. No judge would sign a search warrant based solely on proximity. James began driving past Marsh's house during off-duty hours. He parked down the street and watched. Marsh had odd habits. He gardened at night, working under floodlights in his backyard. He received no visitors. Delivery trucks would arrive, and Marsh would insist on unloading items himself, never allowing workers into his property. James noticed that the house had unusually extensive ventilation for a structure built in 1920. There were vents and exhaust fans that seemed out of place on a Victorian home. James requested building permits for the property. The records showed that Marsh had made extensive basement renovations in 1994, the year before Christopher Dunn disappeared. Marsh had sealed off a section of the original foundation and built new concrete walls. The work had been done without permits, before the county required them for that type of renovation. There was no violation and no grounds for an inspection. 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, James received a call from an elderly woman who refused to give her name. She would only agree to meet in person at a coffee shop in the next town over. When James arrived, he found a woman in her 80s, frail but sharp-eyed. She told him she lived in the house adjacent to Robert Marsh. She had been his neighbor for 40 years, and she had seen things. The woman explained that she kept journals, detailed notes about her daily observations. It was a habit from her career as a librarian. She had noticed strange lights from Marsh's basement windows at night, always on Halloween. She had heard sounds that did not make sense, like children laughing or crying, but muffled, as if coming from underground. And she claimed she had seen children in Marsh's house after they supposedly disappeared. James asked for specifics. The woman opened one of her journals to an entry dated November 2nd, 1995. She had written about seeing movement in Marsh's basement window the night after Christopher Dunn vanished. A small shadow, child-sized, moving past the glass. In 2003, she noted hearing what sounded like a young girl calling for help, voice faint, coming from the direction of Marsh's property. She had called police in 1995 to report her observations. An officer had come, talked to Marsh, and then told the woman that Marsh said she was senile. The officer believed Marsh. The woman was afraid if she pushed further, something would happen to her too. James knew he could not use the testimony. It was circumstantial at best, the observations of an elderly woman with no physical evidence. But it confirmed his instincts. Robert Marsh was responsible. James was certain. The problem was proving it. As the next Halloween approached, James made a decision that would end his career if discovered. He asked his sister if he could take his 9-year-old nephew trick-or-treating. The boy, named Tyler, resembled the missing children. Brown hair, small for his age, trusting face. James outfitted Tyler with a hidden camera in his costume and a small microphone. He positioned himself in an unmarked car with a clear view of Marsh's house. His plan was to send Tyler to Marsh's door while recording everything, hoping Marsh would say or do something incriminating. On Halloween night, James watched as Tyler approached Marsh's porch. Marsh opened the door with his usual smile. He complimented Tyler's costume. He dropped a full-size candy bar into Tyler's bag. They had a brief, pleasant conversation about the weather and how many trick-or-treaters had come by. Then Tyler thanked him and walked away. Nothing happened. Tyler returned to James's car safely. The recording showed nothing but a friendly old man handing out candy. James's partner found out about the unauthorized operation and reported it to their lieutenant. James was suspended for 2 weeks without pay and given a formal written warning. One more violation and he would be terminated. His wife was furious. His sister would not speak to him. James had risked everything and accomplished nothing. 1 week after his suspension ended, James's cell phone rang at 2 a.m. The number was unlisted. When James answered, Robert Marsh's voice came through the line. Marsh asked James to come to his house alone. He said he wanted to clear the air. James knew it was a trap of some kind, but he also knew this might be his only chance. He notified his partner, wore a wire, and drove to Blackwood Lane. Marsh was sitting on his front porch despite the cold November weather. He gestured for James to sit in the chair beside him. Then he spoke. He told James that he knew what James thought. He knew James believed he was responsible for the missing children, and he wanted James to understand something. James would never prove it. James would never find evidence. James would never get a warrant, because Marsh was smarter. He had been doing this longer than James had been alive. Then Marsh said something that made James's blood freeze. "Those children came to me willingly. They wanted the candy. They wanted to see inside. And once they crossed that threshold, well, they never leave." Marsh smiled. James reached for his recording device to confirm it was capturing this confession. The device was dead. The battery had been full when James arrived, but now it showed no power. Marsh laughed. "Even your technology betrays you on my property," he said. "This house protects me. It always has." James sat in his car outside Marsh's house afterward, gun in his lap, considering his options. He could go back inside and shoot Marsh, claim self-defense. But that would not bring back the children. It would not give the families closure. And if Marsh was telling the truth about the house protecting him, maybe killing Marsh would not even end it. James called the FBI cold case unit and requested a federal review. An agent came, interviewed Marsh, searched public records, and concluded there was insufficient evidence for federal involvement. 1 year after Emma Patterson vanished, James stood on Blackwood Lane on Halloween night. Robert Marsh was on his porch, bowl of full-size candy bars visible through the window, children in costumes streaming past. And at 9:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Emma had disappeared the year before, a call came through. A 6-year-old boy named Daniel Garcia was missing, last seen on Blackwood Lane. James ran to Marsh's house. Marsh was still on his porch, surrounded by witnesses who confirmed he had not moved. Marsh smiled at James, did not say a word, did not have to. That smile said everything. James searched for Daniel all night. He brought in cadaver dogs. He got a warrant based on the new disappearance and tore through Marsh's property for 3 days straight. They found nothing. Robert Marsh died 2 years later. Natural causes, heart attack in his sleep. He was 71 years old. When the estate went to auction, James bought the property with money from his retirement account. He quit the sheriff's department and spent the next 6 months tearing down every wall. He excavated the entire basement. He ripped apart the foundation. He brought in ground-penetrating radar. He dug up the backyard. He demolished the garage. He found nothing, no bodies, no evidence, no trace of 5 missing children. The house was condemned and demolished. The lot sat empty, but James still goes there. Every Halloween night, he stands in the spot where Marsh's porch used to be. And sometimes, late at night when the street is empty, he hears children laughing. Not from any particular direction, from the ground itself. And James knows that 5 children vanished on Blackwood Lane over 33 years. He knows their secret is still buried somewhere, deeper than he could dig, in a place that Robert Marsh took to his grave. And James knows that whatever Marsh did, whatever agreement he made, whatever evil he served, it did not die with him. Because the house may be gone, but every Halloween, children still disappear in this county. Different streets, different circumstances. But always Halloween, always between 9:45 and 10 p.m. Always while a trusted adult was nearby. James keeps a map on his wall. Red pins mark every child who has vanished on Halloween in the county over the past 40 years. The pins form a pattern. They radiate outward from where Marsh's house once stood, like something spreading, like something growing. And James understands now that he never had a chance of stopping it, because whatever collected children on Blackwood Lane is older than Robert Marsh. Marsh was just its servant, just its caretaker. And it is still collecting. John had been hosting the overnight radio slot at WKRX for 7 years. It was not glamorous work. The station was small, independently owned, and the only people listening at 2 a.m. were insomniacs, truck drivers, and security guards trying to stay awake. But John loved it. No corporate interference, no strict playlists, just him and whatever music or conversation he felt like sharing with a handful of listeners scattered across 3 counties. The station itself was a converted house on the edge of town, filled with a mix of analog and digital equipment, some pieces older than John himself. On Halloween nights, John would play horror movie soundtracks, take calls about local legends, and generally have fun with the spooky atmosphere. Around 2:30 a.m. on October 31st, a call came through. John answered with his usual greeting, but the voice quality on the other end was wrong. It sounded like someone talking through water, with layers of static that did not match any interference pattern John had heard before. The caller asked a simple question. "Can you play something for the children?" John asked what song they wanted. The voice responded with something that made no sense. "Listen to the frequency between frequencies." Then the line went dead. John made a joke on air about Halloween bringing out the weirdos and moved on to the next song. But during the commercial break, he noticed something odd. The analog VU meters on his mixing board were moving, showing input activity, despite no source being active. John checked his equipment. No microphone was hot, no line was open. But the meters continued to dance, showing signal coming from somewhere. John began scanning frequencies, trying to locate the source of the interference. He worked methodically through the FM band, listening on his headphones. Between 104.2 and 104.4 MHz, he found something impossible. There was a signal at 104.3, a frequency that should have been empty air. Nothing was licensed to broadcast there in this region. The signal should not exist. John isolated it and listened. Children were singing, not a recording. The audio quality was too raw, too immediate. It was a live transmission. The children sang in unison, maybe a dozen voices, young children between ages 5 and 10. But the song was in a language John did not recognize. Not Spanish or French or German. Something older. The melody was simple but unsettling, with intervals that felt wrong, notes that created dissonance even when the children sang in harmony. John recorded 30 seconds of the signal. He considered playing it on air as a Halloween novelty. Mysterious transmission, spooky children singing in an unknown language, perfect for the night. But before he could cue up the recording, another call came through. This time, a woman's voice, terrified and urgent. She begged him not to play their broadcast. She said if he let them through, they would spread. She told him the children were not children. They were echoes, dead frequencies trying to become real again. She said her brother had played their broadcast on Halloween in 1987. His station burned down that night. 7 people died. The call dropped before John could ask questions. He searched online for radio station fires in 1987 and found an incident report. WLMT in Ohio had burned down on October 31st, 1987. 7 fatalities, including the overnight DJ. The cause was never determined. Witnesses reported hearing screaming from the speakers, even after the building was engulfed in flames. Fire investigators found the transmitter was still broadcasting when they arrived, despite the electrical system having failed. John told himself it was an interesting story, but likely a coincidence. He decided to play just a brief clip of the children's song as a Halloween bit, something to entertain the handful of people still listening at this hour. He queued up the recording, opened his microphone, and made a light comment about mysterious Halloween transmissions. Then he hit play. The 30-second clip aired. and immediately, every phone in the building started ringing. Not just the station lines. John's personal cell phone rang. The production studio phone rang. Even an old disconnected rotary phone in the back office, the one that had not been hooked up to anything in years, started ringing. John answered the station line. Screaming poured through the speaker. He hung up and answered his cell phone. Children laughing, the same laughter from the broadcast. He answered the back office line. Heavy breathing, close to the microphone. In the studio, equipment began malfunctioning. The lights flickered. Analog gear that required physical contact to operate started moving on its own. The turntable in the corner spun up despite being unplugged. Tape decks ejected tapes and loaded them backward. And the broadcast, the children's song, continued playing on a loop despite John having stopped it. The audio fed through all channels simultaneously. The volume increased beyond normal limits, the speakers distorting with the intensity. John tried to regain control. He pulled faders down. The audio continued. He cut power to the mixing board. The audio continued. He ran to the transmitter room and threw the main breaker, killing power to the entire building. For 3 seconds, silence. Then the emergency generator kicked on by itself, though John had not activated it. The broadcast resumed, louder than before. Text messages flooded John's phone. Listeners reported radios in their homes turning on by themselves, all tuned to WKRX. People 2 states away, far beyond the station's normal range, claimed they were receiving the broadcast. Car radios locked to the frequency and would not change stations. One message read, "My daughter woke up speaking words from the song. She does not know that language. She is 4 years old, and she will not stop singing it." A text arrived from an unknown number. It identified the sender as Richard Keller, a retired FCC broadcast engineer. The message explained that what John had played was not a recording. It was a trap. In 1952, an experimental station had broadcast a children's chorus on Halloween night. The next day, every child in the chorus was found dead. No marks on the bodies, no explanation. The station director claimed the children kept singing after death, that the broadcast never actually stopped, that it was searching for a way back. The FCC had buried the report and sealed the frequency. John frantically searched FCC archives on his phone. He found references to Project Resonance, a classified experiment from 1953 involving psychic broadcasting. The project had attempted to record dying children's consciousness during their final moments to study what the researchers called consciousness transmission. The project was terminated when all subjects died simultaneously during the first test. Official reports stated all recordings were destroyed. The studio filled with the sound of footsteps, small footsteps, children's footsteps. John was alone in the building, but he heard them clearly, running in the hallway, skipping in the next room, standing just outside the studio door. Security camera feeds on his monitor showed small figures moving through the station, child-sized shadows that should not be there. John locked the studio door. The doorknob began to turn from the outside. The broadcast continued across all frequencies, despite John having cut power to every system. He could hear the children's voices coming from equipment that was not even connected. The sound emerged from the walls themselves. And then John heard something that froze him in place. The children were whispering his name. Not singing it, whispering it. Dozens of small voices saying John over and over. Monitor screens throughout the studio flickered and displayed faces. Children's faces, but distorted. Eyes too large, taking up half the face. Mouths open too wide, showing too many teeth. The children sang silently on the screens, their lips forming the words of that horrible song. John noticed the hands in the video feeds. The children had too many fingers, 7 on each hand, and the hands were reaching toward the camera, toward John, as if trying to break through the glass. John checked his phone for the time. It showed 2:47 a.m., but that was impossible. He had started his shift at midnight. The mysterious call came in at 2:30. He had only been dealing with this situation for maybe 20 minutes. How could hours have passed? He looked at his watch. It showed 2:47. The studio clock showed 2:47. But John's sense of time told him it had been much longer. He felt like he had been trapped in this room for days. He remembered the original caller's words. Listen to the frequency between frequencies. John realized he needed to broadcast a counter signal. He grabbed his microphone and began speaking directly over the children's transmission, but identified himself. He stated the station's call letters. He declared himself the legitimate operator of this frequency. The broadcast stuttered. The children's voices became angry, rising in pitch and volume. Equipment around the studio began sparking. John continued, adding white noise from a generator to create interference. The broadcast weakened slightly, but did not stop. In desperation, John cut all audio. He let dead air fill the frequency. Silence, the ultimate FCC violation, the one thing a station should never broadcast. For 3 minutes, nothing. Complete silence. Then the children returned, louder than before, and now they were saying more than his name. They were speaking in the voices of people John knew. His mother, his dead father, his ex-wife, all using his name. John made a final decision. He picked up a hammer from the station's toolkit. He destroyed the recording device, smashing it until pieces scattered across the floor. He cut cables with wire cutters. He poured his coffee into the mixing board. Sparks erupted. Smoke filled the studio. The main circuit breaker tripped. The building lost power completely. The emergency generator tried to start, but failed. Absolute silence fell. John stood in the dark studio, breathing hard, waiting. The silence continued. Emergency lights came on, bathing everything in red. The broadcast was gone. The FCC arrived 3 days later to investigate the unauthorized transmission. They found equipment destroyed and burn patterns throughout the studio. John showed them his recording of the original signal. The file played but contained no audio, just silence. Listeners who had called or texted John denied hearing anything unusual. They claimed John was mistaken or having some kind of breakdown. Text message records showed no communications during the time John described. The only evidence was the destroyed equipment and John's testimony. WKRX's owner shut down the station permanently. The broadcasting license was sold to a corporate conglomerate. The building was condemned due to electrical hazards. John could not find radio work after the incident. Station managers heard about what happened and decided he was unstable. His career in broadcasting ended that Halloween night. But the broadcast did not end. 3 years later, John works in IT support. He has not been near a radio station since. But every Halloween night at 2:47 a.m., his devices activate. His phone plays static. Computer speakers hum. The car radio turns on by itself. And through the noise, faint but unmistakable, children singing. The same song, the same language. John records it, but the audio never captures anything. The broadcast exists only for him now. John researched other incidents and found 17 radio stations that experienced similar events on Halloween between 1952 and the present. All closed afterward. All overnight DJs either dead or vanished. John survived. But the frequency between frequencies is always there, waiting. Every year on Halloween, those dead children try to sing their way back into the world. They came closest through John, and he knows that one day, during one Halloween broadcast somewhere, they will succeed. Someone will play their song long enough. And when that happens, the children from Project Resonance will finally return. And John believes with absolute certainty that the world is not ready for what those children have become in the 70 years they have been trapped between frequencies. Michael was in his second year of doctoral studies in American folklore at the State University when his advisors suggested a research angle that would distinguish his dissertation. Contemporary Halloween practices in isolated rural communities. Specifically, towns that maintained pre-commercial traditions, the kind of celebrations that existed before Halloween became a corporate holiday. His advisor mentioned a small town called Samhain Grove, population 400, that allegedly preserved Celtic harvest rituals dating back to the town's founding in 1843. Michael had a master's degree in anthropology and had published papers on folk ritual continuity. He was fluent in Gaelic. His research goal was straightforward: document authentic traditional practices, conduct interviews with residents, and observe the October celebrations firsthand. His dissertation would be the first comprehensive academic study of Samhain Grove's customs. The town was 40 miles from the nearest highway, accessible only by a single-lane road through dense forest. Michael's cell phone lost reception 20 miles out. The GPS stopped working 10 miles from town. He navigated by following hand-painted signs nailed to trees. When he finally arrived, Samhain Grove looked like it existed outside of time. There were no commercial businesses except one general store, no gas station, no restaurants. Houses were spread far apart, connected by dirt roads. The most prominent feature was the town square, where a massive carved pumpkin sat displayed under a glass case. According to a plaque, the pumpkin was preserved from the town's founding in 1843. It should have rotted to nothing in 182 years, but it looked almost fresh. Michael rented a room at the town's only boarding house. The clerk, a woman in her 50s, accepted his payment, but warned him that the town valued privacy. Research was acceptable, but he should not interfere with community practices. She said that outsiders generally left before October, and her tone suggested he should do the same. Michael thanked her and said he specifically wanted to observe October traditions. The woman's expression hardened, but she said nothing more. Over the following days, Michael noticed that everyone in Samhain Grove displayed pumpkin imagery, carved on doors, tattooed on forearms, painted on mailboxes. But these were not jack-o'-lanterns. They were something older, faces with too many teeth, eyes that seemed to follow movement, symbols that looked like corrupted Celtic knots. Michael photographed everything and filled notebooks with observations. The town council met to discuss Michael's presence. He was not invited to the meeting, but afterward, a woman named Linda approached him at the boarding house. She identified herself as the council leader. She told Michael that they had decided to permit him to observe the Festival of Halloween on Halloween night. He could take notes and photographs for his research. But he had to follow 3 rules. First, do not speak during the ceremony. Second, do not leave the designated observer area. Third, destroy all photographs before leaving town. If he violated these rules, there would be consequences. She handed him a written waiver, releasing the town of liability for spiritual consequences. Michael signed without hesitation. He was excited despite the ominous tone. This was exactly the kind of authentic practice he needed for his dissertation. After he signed, the town's residents became friendly. They invited him to dinners. They taught him about their pumpkin cultivation methods. They showed him historical documents about the town's founding Linda gave Michael access to the town archives, housed in the basement of the meeting hall. The original journals from 1843 described bringing old ways to the New World and establishing Samhain Grove as a place where the barrier thins and the harvest feeds both the living and the other. One entry described a founding sacrifice where 7 children were given to the soil to consecrate the land for proper harvest. Subsequent entries detailed annual rituals, each requiring an offering of innocence on Halloween to keep the bargain with what sleeps beneath. Michael found court records from 1956 when the state investigated Samhain Grove after a neighboring town reported missing children. The investigation ended abruptly. All records were sealed. The state investigator died in a car accident 2 days after leaving town. Michael told himself this was historical, not contemporary. Surely the town was not still practicing human sacrifice. On October 31st, the entire town transformed. Every resident participated in preparations. They hollowed out dozens of massive pumpkins, each weighing over 100 pounds, grown in the communal field at the edge of town. They carved specific symbols into each pumpkin, not faces. Geometric patterns and writing that Michael recognized as pre-Christian Celtic script, though distorted in ways he had never seen. The pumpkins were arranged in concentric circles around the town square. At the center, workers opened the glass case containing the ancient preserved pumpkin. When the case opened, Michael smelled decay, despite the pumpkin appearing intact. Michael noticed 7 children, ages ranging from 6 to 10, dressed in ceremonial robes. Their faces were painted with pumpkin pulp. Linda led them to the center circle. Michael asked about the children. Linda smiled and said they were the chosen ones, a great honor for their families. Michael felt uncomfortable, but could not articulate why. He considered leaving, but his academic curiosity overrode his instinct. After sunset, the entire town gathered around the pumpkin circles. Michael was placed on an elevated platform with his notebook and camera. The town elder, a man whose age was impossible to determine, began chanting in a language that sounded like Gaelic but distorted. The community joined the chant. 7 children were led forward, each positioned inside a hollow pumpkin carved large enough for a child to fit inside. Lids were placed on the pumpkins. The chanting intensified. The pumpkins began to pulse, visibly expanding and contracting like lungs breathing. Michael photographed this, his hands shaking. Vines emerged from the soil and wrapped around the pumpkins. The children inside began screaming. The community continued chanting, showing no reaction to the screams. The elder approached each pumpkin and poured black liquid through the carved mouths. Michael recognized the smell. Blood mixed with something fermented. The vines dragged the pumpkins with the children still inside them, beneath the soil. The ground swallowed them completely. The children's screams became muffled, then silent. The ground stopped moving. The chanting continued for another 30 minutes. Michael tried to leave the platform, violating the second rule. Town members who seemed to appear from nowhere immediately restrained him. The ground where the pumpkins disappeared began moving again. 7 shapes emerged. Pumpkin-like objects covered in soil and pulsing with internal movement. The pumpkins cracked open. 7 figures stepped out. They had the children's body shapes, but their faces were gone, replaced with carved pumpkin features cut directly into their flesh. Eyes, nose, and mouth carved into living tissue that glowed with internal orange light. The town members bowed. The figures walked among the community, touching people's heads. Where they touched, people wept with joy. Linda approached the restrained Michael and whispered an explanation. He was witnessing the hollowing. The 7 children gave their faces so the harvest spirit could walk among them for one night. Tomorrow morning, the children would return to normal. mostly. The spirit remembers them always and protects the town's crops. Every generation provides 7 volunteers. It is a great privilege. The elder approached Michael's platform. He said that observers become participants when outsiders witness the hollowing. Michael had agreed to spiritual consequences in the waiver. Now he must contribute to the harvest. Town members dragged Michael to the center circle and forced him to his knees before the ancient preserved pumpkin. One of the carved-faced children approached and placed hands on Michael's face. Michael felt intense burning. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The child's touch left carved patterns on Michael's face, shallow cuts forming a pumpkin's eyes and mouth. Not deep enough to scar permanently, but deep enough to bleed. Town members collected Michael's blood in a bowl and poured it into the ancient pumpkin. The pumpkin's interior glowed briefly. Linda told Michael he was harvest-marked now. He could not speak of what he witnessed. If he tried, the mark would activate and he would feel what the children felt. Complete hollowing. Michael woke in his boarding house bed the next morning. His face was bandaged. He had no memory of returning. He went to the town square in daylight. No evidence of the ritual remained. The pumpkins were gone. The ground was undisturbed. The 7 children played normally in the street, faces intact, laughing. Michael approached them and asked if they remembered the ceremony. The children looked at him blankly and said they had a normal Halloween, trick-or-treating and everything. Michael checked his camera. All photos from the ceremony were corrupted. Images showed only black frames or static. His written notes remained, but were in a language he did not recognize, though he knew he had written them. He packed immediately and drove away. By the time he reached his university, the cuts on his face had healed completely, leaving no physical evidence. Michael tried telling his advisor what happened. The words would not form. Every attempt to describe the ritual caused intense facial pain, burning where he had been marked. He tried writing about it. His hand cramped and refused to complete sentences. He attempted recording audio testimony. His voice distorted and the recorder malfunctioned. He switched dissertation topics and never mentioned Samhain Grove again. Every Halloween since that night, Michael experiences the same thing. At sunset on October 31st, his face burns. The carved pattern reappears on his skin, visible only to him in mirrors, glowing faint orange from within. He hears 7 children singing in that distorted language. He smells pumpkin rot. He tastes blood. The mark fades by November 1st, but it always returns. Michael is 43 now. That night in Samhain Grove happened 17 years ago. He has never returned to that town. He has never successfully spoken about what happened. And sometimes, late on Halloween nights, he wonders how many other researchers carry similar marks. How many people have witnessed the festival of Halloween and been silenced. Michael knows Samhain Grove still performs the ritual every year. He knows 7 children are chosen, and he knows with terrible certainty that some traditions should not be preserved. But traditions do not die when they are fed. They grow, and one day, Samhain Grove's harvest will spread beyond one small town. One day the pumpkins will demand more faces, and when that happens, Michael will feel it in his carved flesh. He will be summoned back, because once harvest marked, one is never truly free. One is part of the crop, and eventually the harvest claims all it touches. William and Linda had lived in their suburban neighborhood for 8 years. They knew all their neighbors, attended block parties, and their 2 kids played with every other child on the street. Halloween was Linda's favorite holiday, and every year she went all out with decorations, carved multiple pumpkins, and prepared full-size candy bars for trick-or-treaters. Their house was the most popular on the block, with lines of kids waiting on the porch some years. The neighborhood was safe, family-friendly, with no history of crime. Houses sat close together with good street lights illuminating every corner. On October 31st at 6:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. William answered. A boy stood on the porch, approximately 10 years old, dressed as a skeleton. The costume was realistic, with glow-in-the-dark bones painted on black fabric. The boy carried an orange plastic pumpkin bucket. He did not say trick or treat. He just stood silently, holding out his bucket. William dropped in a candy bar and complimented the costume. The boy did not respond. He turned and walked away. William noticed unusual details about the encounter. The boy had arrived alone. No parent was visible on the street. William had not heard him approach, despite the porch boards creaking under any weight. The boy's face was oddly pale, possibly makeup. When the boy turned away, William noticed the costume was old-fashioned, not the current year's style. The fabric looked aged. Linda asked who was at the door. William described the skeleton boy. Linda checked their neighborhood directory. No children that age lived on their street. The youngest kids were William and Linda's own, ages 7 and 9. The oldest was a teenager. There was no 10-year-old boy in the neighborhood. At 7:15 p.m., the doorbell rang again. William answered. The same skeleton boy stood there, holding out his bucket. William was confused. He asked if the boy had already come by. The boy did not respond. William gave him another candy bar. The boy walked away. At 7:58 p.m., the doorbell rang again. The same boy. Same silent request. William asked where his parents were. The boy stared without speaking. William gave him candy and watched as the boy walked into the darkness between streetlights and seemed to vanish. At 8:33 p.m., the boy returned. William refused to answer the door this time. He watched through the window. The boy stood on the porch for a full 5 minutes, motionless, then walked away. Linda thought William was playing a prank. She said she would answer the door next time. At 9:07 p.m., the doorbell rang. Linda opened the door. The same skeleton boy stood there. Linda gave him candy and asked how many times he had come by. The boy spoke for the first time, his voice flat and distant. He said he was still trick-or-treating and had to finish his route. Linda asked where he lived. The boy pointed at William and Linda's house. He said he lived here. William and Linda conferred inside. The boy claimed their house was his home. They checked the property's history. They had purchased it 8 years ago from an elderly couple who had lived there for 43 years. The house was built in 1967. William called the previous owners, now in assisted living, and asked if they knew about a boy or if a child had died on the property. The previous owners said there had been no deaths in the house during their time. But the people before them, there had been a tragedy in the 1970s. The owner did not know the full story. Linda searched county death records. She found an entry. David Hatcher, age 10, died October 31st, 1978. The address matched their house. Cause of death was listed as hit by car while trick-or-treating. He died at the scene, 1 block from home. A local news archive included a photo. The boy in the picture matched the description of their skeleton costume visitor. At 9:45 p.m., the doorbell rang continuously. 15 times in 2 minutes. William opened the door. The skeleton boy stood there with his bucket extended, but his face was fully visible now through the makeup. The skin was translucent, eyes sunken deep. There was a see-through quality to his entire figure. William slammed the door. The boy did not leave. William watched through the peephole. The boy stood motionless, facing the door. Minutes passed. The boy did not move. Linda called the police non-emergency line. She explained a child was harassing them, leaving out the ghost details. The dispatcher said an officer would come by. The officer arrived at 10:15 p.m. William and Linda explained that a boy was standing outside. The officer checked. No one was there. He searched the yard and found nothing. The officer left. The moment his patrol car rounded the corner, the doorbell rang. The boy had returned. Linda's son came downstairs and said there was a boy looking in his window. William went to the room and looked out. The skeleton boy stood in the backyard, staring up at the house. William yelled for him to leave. The boy did not move. William ran outside to confront him. The backyard was empty. William returned inside. The doorbell rang. The boy was at the front door again. Linda's daughter said she had seen the boy earlier in the evening. She thought he was a neighborhood kid and had invited him inside before Linda noticed. The boy had stood in the foyer for a long time, looking around like he was remembering something. When Linda asked him to leave, the boy said this was his house and Linda was in his room. Based on the house layout from 1978, Linda's daughter's bedroom would have been where David Hatcher's room once was. Linda sat on the porch and addressed the boy directly the next time the doorbell rang. She called him by name, David. She told him she knew who he was and what happened to him, but he could not stay. This was not his house anymore. The boy stopped holding out his bucket. He spoke clearly for the first time. He said he did not finish trick-or-treating. He was coming home to show his parents his candy when the car hit him right there. He pointed at the street, but he got back up. He had to show his parents his candy, had to finish Halloween. They were waiting for him. Linda gently explained that his parents were gone. Many years had passed. He was not alive. The boy became agitated. He insisted he was trick-or-treating. He had candy. He shook his bucket, and Linda heard something rattling inside. She glimpsed old wrappers from 1970s brands, disintegrated chocolate pieces. William realized what was happening. The boy did not know he was dead. He had been repeating his Halloween route for 46 years. He could not move on until he completed the ritual of showing his parents his candy. William told Linda his idea. They could act as surrogate parents, complete the ritual, give the boy closure. William initially resisted his own suggestion, but Linda agreed after seeing the anguish in the boy's eyes. They invited the boy inside. David entered hesitantly. He looked around, confused. The house was different. Linda told him they were proud of him and asked him to show them his candy. David emptied his bucket on the coffee table. Ancient, decomposed candy spilled out. Wrappers from brands that had been extinct for decades. Some were so old the logos were barely visible. William and Linda praised his haul. They asked about his night. David described his trick-or-treating route from 46 years ago. He named houses and neighbors long gone. He talked about friends who would now be in their 50s if they were still alive. As David talked, he became more transparent. His voice faded. The edges of his form blurred. Linda said he had done such a good job trick-or-treating, and it was time for him to go to bed now. David nodded. He asked if he could have a Snickers bar first. Linda gave him candy from her bowl. David took it and smiled for the first time. A genuine child smile, free of sadness. He said thank you and that he loved her. He walked toward the stairs. His form faded with each step. Before he reached the top, he was gone completely. On the coffee table where David had emptied his bucket, a pile of candy wrappers remained. Mars bars from 1970s packaging. Bonkers candy discontinued in the 1990s. Wacky wafers, all aged and decayed. William photographed them. He touched one. the wrapper crumbled to dust. By morning, all the wrappers had disintegrated into fine powder. William contacted the local historical society and asked about David Hatcher. They confirmed the incident. David had been trick-or-treating with friends on Halloween 1978. He ran ahead of the group, excited to get home and show his parents his candy. A car struck him 1 block from his house. The driver never saw him in his dark costume. David died on the street while his friends screamed for help. His parents arrived moments after. They never recovered from the loss. They moved away within a year. The house was sold to another family. David's parents both died in the early 2000s. They were buried together in the town cemetery. William and Linda visited David's grave. The headstone was small and weathered. The inscription read, "David Hatcher, beloved son, 1968-1978. May his joy be eternal." They left a full-size Snickers bar on the grave. When they returned a week later, the candy bar was gone. Not taken by animals, simply gone, as if someone had accepted the gift. William and Linda have lived in their house for 5 more years since that Halloween. David has never returned. The doorbell does not ring unexpectedly. There are no faces in windows, no footsteps in empty rooms. But every Halloween, Linda leaves a full-size Snickers bar on the porch before bringing in the candy bowl for the night. And every Halloween morning, the Snickers bar is gone. They tell themselves animals take it, but they know better. David stops by once a year on his eternal trick-or-treating route to visit the people who gave him peace, to visit the surrogate parents who told him it was okay to stop searching, to visit the house that was once his home and finally let him rest. Mary had been a licensed clinical psychologist for 19 years, specializing in trauma and grief counseling. Her practice was in a quiet office building in a mid-sized city, and she maintained a reputation for helping clients work through the most difficult experiences of their lives. She was methodical, evidence-based, and deeply skeptical of anything that could not be explained through psychology or neuroscience. She did not believe in the supernatural. She believed in the power of the human mind to create narratives that explain traumatic experiences. And she was good at helping people separate reality from the stories their trauma had created. On October 29th, a new client named James called her office requesting an emergency appointment. He said he had been referred by another therapist who could no longer help him. Mary's receptionist checked the schedule. Mary had one opening on October 31st at 7 p.m., her last appointment of the day. James said he would take it. His voice sounded strained, desperate. The receptionist noted that he specifically asked if Mary would be willing to stay late past sunset. Mary confirmed she would stay as long as necessary. She had handled crisis interventions before. This would be no different. James arrived exactly at 7 p.m. on Halloween night. He was in his early 40s, well-dressed but disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he had not slept in days. He sat down in Mary's office and immediately asked if she believed in curses. Mary gave her standard response. She believed in psychological phenomena that people sometimes interpreted as curses. Intrusive thoughts, anxiety, trauma responses, obsessive-compulsive patterns. All of these could feel like being cursed, but were actually treatable conditions. James nodded as if he had expected that answer. Then he told his story. 3 years ago, he had attended a Halloween party at a friend's estate. The friend was wealthy and eccentric, interested in occult history. The party had a theme: authentic Victorian spiritualism. The house was decorated with period-appropriate items: seance tables, spirit boards, mourning photography, post-mortem daguerreotypes. Among the decorations was an antique mirror, approximately 4 feet tall, framed in black wood with carved symbols. James said the host explained the mirror's history during the party. It had belonged to a Victorian-era medium named Eleanor Vance, who claimed she could communicate with the dead through reflections. According to the story, Eleanor would have clients look into the mirror on All Hallows' Eve, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, and the mirror would show them their deceased loved ones. But something went wrong during a seance in 1891. A client looked into the mirror and saw something that was not their loved one, something that had been waiting on the other side. The client went mad and died within a week. Eleanor Vance sealed the mirror and warned that it should never be used on Halloween night again. James told Mary that he had been drunk at the party. He thought the story was entertaining fiction. Around midnight, on a dare, he stood in front of the mirror. He looked at his reflection. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then his reflection smiled at him. He had not smiled. His reflection had smiled independently. Mary interrupted and offered a rational explanation. Alcohol impairs perception and judgment. The mirror was old, possibly warped, which could distort reflections. The lighting at a party creates shadows and movement that the brain interprets as meaningful. James was experiencing a false memory enhanced by suggestion and anxiety. This was textbook psychology. James continued as if Mary had not spoken. After that night, things changed. He started seeing his reflection behave differently than his actual movements. Small things at first. A delay of half a second. A slight difference in facial expression. Then more obvious discrepancies. His reflection would move when he stood still. Would face different directions. Would appear in mirrors even when James was not standing in front of them. Mary took notes and suggested a neurological evaluation. Visual hallucinations could indicate various conditions: migraines, seizures, even brain tumors. James needed medical testing, not therapy. James said he had been tested. MRI, CT scan, full neurological workup. Everything came back normal. 6 different doctors found nothing wrong. The incidents escalated, James explained. His reflection started appearing in other reflective surfaces. Windows, car mirrors, phone screens, even puddles of water. And the reflection was changing. It looked like him, but different. Thinner, paler. The eyes were wrong, darker, with a predatory quality. The smile was too wide. And worst of all, the reflection was trying to communicate. It would mouth words, would press its hands against the glass from the inside as if trying to break through. Mary suggested this was a manifestation of dissociation, possibly depersonalization disorder. The feeling that one's reflection is separate from oneself is a documented psychological phenomenon. James was not experiencing anything supernatural. He was experiencing a treatable mental health condition. James reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera app and set it to selfie mode. He held the phone so both he and Mary could see the screen. James's face appeared in the camera view. Normal. Then James turned the phone slightly, angling it to show his reflection in the office window behind him. In the window's reflection, James's face was different. The expression was wrong. The eyes were too dark. And as Mary watched, the reflection smiled while James's actual face remained neutral. Mary felt a chill but maintained her professional composure. She suggested it was a trick of light, a camera artifact, a problem with the phone's lens. James turned the phone back to normal selfie mode. His face looked normal again. He switched back to showing the window reflection. The wrong face returned. Mary asked to see the phone. James handed it to her. She examined it. The device was functioning normally. No cracks in the lens. No obvious explanation. Mary suggested they conduct an experiment. She stood next to James and looked at the window reflection. In the reflection, she saw herself normally. But James's reflection beside her had that wrong expression, that too wide smile, those dark eyes. Mary looked directly at James. His actual face was neutral, concerned, normal. She looked back at the reflection. Still wrong. She closed her eyes, counted to 5, opened them. The reflection had not changed. Mary felt her skepticism cracking, but clung to rationality. There had to be an explanation. Some property of the window glass, some optical illusion they were both perceiving. She suggested they move to a different room. They went to her waiting area. James stood in front of a large mirror on the wall. Mary stood beside him. In the mirror, Mary's reflection was normal. James's reflection had its hand raised in a wave. James's actual hand was at his side. Mary asked James to raise his hand. James raised his hand. In the mirror, the reflection lowered its hand. They were moving in opposite directions. Mary reached out and touched the mirror. The surface was cool, solid glass. She looked at her own reflection. Normal. She looked at James's reflection. It was staring directly at her now, ignoring the actual James. The reflection's eyes locked onto Mary's eyes, and it mouthed a word. Soon. Mary stepped back from the mirror. Her heart was racing. She had no explanation. She had witnessed something that should not be possible. James asked if she believed him now. Mary said she needed to think. She needed to research. She asked James to leave and return for another appointment. James said there was no point. He had seen that look before on the faces of the other therapists. The look that said they had seen something they could not explain and wanted nothing to do with him. James told Mary the final part of his story. The reflection was getting stronger. It could hold its independence for longer periods. And 3 days ago, on October 28th, James woke up unable to move. He was paralyzed in bed, but he could see. And in the bedroom mirror across from his bed, his reflection was moving freely. It got out of the bed in the reflection. It walked around the reflected room. It stared at James's paralyzed body and laughed silently. After 10 minutes, James could move again. The reflection was back to normal. James said he knew what was happening. The thing in the mirror was getting ready to switch places. On Halloween night, when the veil is thinnest, it would complete the exchange. James would be trapped in the mirror world, and the reflection would take his place in reality. He had come to Mary hoping a therapist could help, but he realized now that no one could stop what was coming. He was telling Mary as a warning, do not look in mirrors on Halloween night. Do not let your reflection catch you unaware. James stood to leave. Mary asked what he would do. James said he had one option left. If he destroyed every reflective surface in his home, covered every window, avoided every mirror, he might survive the night. He was going home to seal himself in a room with no reflections. No glass, no metal, no water, no screens. He would sit in darkness until November 1st. And he would pray that the thing in the mirror could not reach him without a surface to cross through. Mary tried to convince James to stay. She could call a colleague, arrange a psychiatric evaluation, get him help. James said there was no help. He had consulted priests, paranormal investigators, occult experts, everyone he could find. They all said the same thing. Once the mirror claims you, there is no escape. The only chance is to deny it access on Halloween night. James left. Mary sat in her office, shaking. She looked at her reflection in the window. Normal. She looked away and took deep breaths. She told herself there was a rational explanation she had not yet discovered. She would research optical illusions, perceptual disorders, shared hallucinations. There had to be science that explained this. Mary stayed late in her office, researching. She lost track of time. When she finally checked her phone, it was 11:47 p.m. Still October 31st, 13 minutes until midnight. She gathered her things and prepared to leave. As she reached for her coat, she caught sight of her reflection in the office window. Her reflection was putting on a coat. But Mary had not touched her coat yet. Her hand was still extended toward it. In the reflection, her hand was already holding it. Mary froze. She watched her reflection finish putting on the coat, pick up the briefcase, and walk toward the door. Mary had not moved. Her reflection reached the door in the mirror. It turned and looked directly at Mary. It smiled. Then it stepped through the door in the reflection and disappeared. Mary could not move. She stood paralyzed, staring at the window. In the reflection, the office was empty. She was not there. She looked down at her physical body, still present. She looked back at the window. No reflection. She was casting no reflection. Mary's phone buzzed. Midnight, November 1st. Halloween was over. Mary raised her hand. In the window, nothing. No reflection raised its hand back. Mary understood then what James had been trying to warn her about. By witnessing his curse, by seeing his reflection's independence, she had attracted its attention. And now something in the mirror world knew she existed. Something that had taken her reflection. Something that would be waiting the next time she looked in a mirror, ready to complete what it had started. Mary has not looked in a mirror since that night. She avoids all reflective surfaces. She had the mirrors in her home removed. She keeps her phone screen off. She does not go near windows after dark. But sometimes, in the peripheral vision, she sees movement in a turned-off computer screen, in a darkened window, in the chrome of a passing car. And she knows her reflection is still out there, living her life in the mirror world, growing stronger, waiting for the next Halloween when the veil will thin again and the exchange can be completed. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true Lighthouse Keeper horror stories that will make you question what really happens when human beings are isolated at the edge of the world, where land meets endless ocean. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters documented by lighthouse keepers who face the unknown in America's most remote and unforgiving maritime stations. Each story has been gathered from keeper testimonials, historical records, and first-hand accounts that reveal the psychological and paranormal terrors that await in these solitary towers. Lighthouses were built to guide ships to safety, but some of them harbor darkness that no beam of light can ever penetrate. If you enjoy authentic horror content that exposes the terrifying reality of isolation and the unexplained, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into true maritime horror. After you hear these harrowing testimonies, we want to know in the comments below if you would ever take a job as a lighthouse keeper after learning what truly awaits in these isolated stations. Now prepare yourself as we descend into the 7 most disturbing true lighthouse keeper horror stories ever documented. 3 years ago, I accepted a position that would change my life forever. I was stationed at Beacon Point Lighthouse off the coast of Maine, and the pay was decent enough for someone fresh out of college who needed isolation to finish writing a novel. I had graduated with a degree in English literature and had spent the last year working retail jobs that drained every ounce of creativity from my body. When I saw the listing for a lighthouse keeper position that offered room and board plus a modest salary, I applied immediately without really understanding what I was getting myself into. The job description made it sound romantic. almost like something out of a Gothic novel. I would be responsible for basic maintenance, monitoring weather equipment, and serving as an emergency contact point for the Coast Guard. The lighthouse itself had been automated decades ago, so the actual light required no manual operation. It seemed perfect for someone like me who wanted nothing more than solitude and time to write. The interview process was surprisingly brief. The hiring manager, an older man from the Maritime Historical Preservation Society, asked me only a handful of questions about my comfort with isolation and my ability to handle basic repairs. He mentioned that the position had high turnover and that most keepers stayed only a single season before requesting transfer. I assumed this was because of the harsh Maine winters or perhaps the monotony of the work. He did not mention anything else, and I did not think to ask why so many people left. I should have asked more questions, but I was young and desperate to escape the suffocating routine of my life. I signed the contract that same afternoon. Beacon Point Lighthouse sits on a rocky outcrop about 2 miles from the nearest coastal town. It is accessible only by boat, and during severe weather, that boat cannot make the crossing safely. The structure itself dates back to 1867, a towering white cylinder with red trim that rises 115 feet above the churning Atlantic. The keeper's quarters occupy the base of the lighthouse, a compact 2-room living space with a kitchen area, a small bedroom, and a bathroom that was clearly added long after the original construction. Everything about the place felt frozen in time, as though decades had passed without anyone caring enough to modernize beyond the absolute necessities. The walls were thick stone, the windows were narrow and drafty, and the spiral staircase that led up to the lantern room was made of iron that groaned with every step. I arrived at Beacon Point in late October, right at the end of the traditional keeper rotation season. The man I was replacing, whose name I never learned, barely spoke to me during the 30-minute handover. He showed me where the tools were kept, how to check the weather monitoring equipment, and how to contact the mainland in case of emergency. He seemed exhausted, with deep circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made me uncomfortable. When I asked him if he had any advice for me, he paused at the door with his bags already in hand and said only, "Do not go up to the lantern room after dark unless you absolutely have to." Then he left without another word, practically running down to the dock where the supply boat waited. I watched him leave and felt my first real twinge of unease, but I dismissed it as the paranoia of someone who had spent too long in isolation. The first 3 nights at Beacon Point were exactly what I had hoped for. I spent my days exploring the rocky coastline, taking photographs, and making notes for my novel. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals and read by lamplight in the keeper's quarters. The sound of the ocean was constant, a rhythmic crashing that became almost meditative after a while. I felt more at peace than I had in years. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkness every 15 seconds, its automated rotation so precise that I could set my watch by it. I began to establish a routine, waking early to check equipment, spending midday writing, and using the evenings to maintain the building and grounds. On my 4th night at Beacon Point, while I was reviewing the maintenance logs in the keeper's quarters, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The logs were kept in a series of leather-bound journals that dated back decades, each one filled with the neat handwriting of various keepers documenting weather conditions, equipment repairs, and supply deliveries. I had been reading through them out of curiosity, enjoying the glimpse into the lives of the men and women who had kept this lighthouse operational over the years. Most entries were mundane, but then I found a journal from 1923, and within its pages were entries that did not match the others in tone or content. The keeper's name had been Ashton McGregor, and his entries from September through November of that year grew increasingly disturbed. He wrote about hearing footsteps ascending the spiral staircase at exactly 2:47 in the morning, every single night without fail. At first, McGregor assumed it was the metal contracting in the cold, but he began to notice that the footsteps had a rhythm, a deliberate pace that suggested something walking rather than something settling. He wrote that he would lie awake, listening to them climb, counting each step, and that they always stopped just outside the lantern room door. McGregor's final entry, dated November 19th, simply read, "The footsteps reached 47 tonight. There are only 42 steps. I do not know what this means, but I am afraid to find out." I sat in the dim light of the keeper's quarters, staring at those words and feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean wind seeping through the walls. I told myself it was just the frightened imagination of a man who had been isolated too long, that there was nothing supernatural about old buildings making noise at night. Metal expands and contracts, wood settles, wind creates strange sounds in confined spaces. I closed the journal and tried to return to my own writing, but I could not concentrate. The words from 1923 kept echoing in my mind. That night, at exactly 2:47 in the morning, I heard the footsteps for the first time. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, but hovering in that space between wakefulness and dreams, when the sound jerked me fully alert. It was exactly as McGregor had described. Slow, methodical footsteps climbing the iron spiral staircase. Each footfall created a distinct metallic ring that echoed through the hollow tower. I lay frozen, barely breathing, as the footsteps ascended. I began counting them automatically. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm never varied, never hesitated. 10, 15, 20. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. 30, 35, 40. The footsteps reached the level where I knew the lantern room door should stop them, but they did not stop. 41, 42, 43. They continued climbing stairs that did not exist. 44, 45, 46, 47, then silence. I remained in my bed for another hour, too terrified to move, before I finally forced myself to get up. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and slowly opened the door to the stairwell. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but empty iron steps spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed carefully, checking each step, but found nothing unusual. The lantern room door was closed, just as I had left it. I opened it and swept my light across the circular chamber. Everything was exactly as it should be. The automated beacon rotated smoothly on its mount, casting its powerful beam out across the black ocean. There was no sign that anyone or anything had been there. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, or that I had heard some acoustic trick caused by the wind or the waves. But I knew what I had heard. Those footsteps had been real, and they had climbed beyond the physical limits of the staircase. I barely slept for the remainder of that night. And when dawn finally came, I felt exhausted and shaken. The footsteps came again the next night, and the night after that. Always at 2:47 in the morning, always 47 steps. I began to document them in the current maintenance log, just as McGregor must have done nearly a century before me. I told myself I was being scientific, collecting data, but really, I was just trying to maintain some sense of control over a situation that made no rational sense. On the 8th night, I made a decision that I would later recognize as either incredibly brave or phenomenally stupid. I positioned myself on the staircase before 2:47, sitting on one of the iron steps about halfway up, flashlight in hand and my phone recording audio. I wanted proof, or at least confirmation, that I was not losing my mind. When 2:47 arrived, The footsteps began right on schedule. But this time, I was in their path. The sound started below me, at the base of the lighthouse, and began climbing toward me. I could feel the vibrations through the iron steps beneath me, could hear the distinct ring of footfalls on metal. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the flashlight. The footsteps climbed closer. 10 steps below me. 5 steps below me. I shone my light down the stairwell and saw absolutely nothing. But the footsteps continued. 3 steps below me. 2 steps. I pressed myself against the curved wall as the sound reached the step I was sitting on. And I swear I felt something pass through me. A coldness so intense, it felt like being plunged into Arctic water. Then the footsteps continued upward, and I could do nothing but sit there trembling and counting. 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. Silence. I reviewed the audio recording immediately, my hands still shaking. The footsteps were captured clearly on the recording, each one distinct and unmistakable. I had proof that I was not hallucinating. But that proof only made everything more terrifying. Something was climbing those stairs every night, something I could hear and apparently feel, but could not see. The following day, I took the supply boat to the mainland and spent hours in the local Historical Society archives, searching for information about Ashton McGregor and Beacon Point Lighthouse. What I discovered made the situation infinitely worse. McGregor had died on November 20th, 1923, the day after his final journal entry. According to the official report, he had fallen from the lighthouse gallery, the narrow walkway that encircles the lantern room at the top of the structure. The fall had killed him instantly. The report ruled it an accidental death. But there was a handwritten note in the margin from the investigating officer that simply said, "Peculiar that an experienced keeper would be on the gallery in darkness during a storm." I dug deeper and eventually found McGregor's personal effects, which had been donated to the Historical Society decades earlier. Among them was a second journal, one that had not been kept in the official logs at the lighthouse. In this private journal, McGregor wrote about his partner keeper, a man whose name had been redacted from all official documents. McGregor described this man as increasingly violent and erratic, prone to fits of rage and paranoid delusions. The final entries suggested that McGregor feared for his safety and had written to the Maritime Authority requesting an emergency transfer. That transfer never came. The implication was clear, though never officially stated. McGregor had not fallen from the gallery. He had been pushed. And whatever remained of him, or whatever echo of his final moments persisted, was still climbing those stairs every night, still counting the steps he took before he reached the top, before someone pushed him over the railing to his death, 47 steps up in a lighthouse that only had 42. I returned to Beacon Point that evening because I had signed a contract, and because I foolishly thought I could handle a few more nights. But on my final night at the lighthouse, the footsteps did not stop outside the lantern room door. For the first time since I had arrived, they continued into the lantern room itself. I heard the iron door creak open, heard the footsteps cross the floor above me. I grabbed my phone and fled to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, even though I knew a lock would do nothing against something that was not physical. Then I heard it. A sound I will never forget as long as I live. Someone was tapping on the glass of the lantern room windows, and the automated beacon's light was flickering in a pattern. I recorded it on my phone, my hands shaking so badly, the video was almost unusable. Later, when I showed that video to someone who knew Morse code, they told me what the pattern spelled out. Just one word as repeated over and over in the flickering light. Pushed, pushed, pushed. I evacuated at dawn when the supply boat arrived. my relief keeper taking one look at my face and not asking any questions. I submitted my resignation that same day. I later learned that the lighthouse authorities had commissioned a full investigation into McGregor's death after I shared what I had found. The case was officially reopened, and though they never found enough evidence for criminal charges, the historical record was amended to note that McGregor's death was likely not accidental. His family, what remained of them, finally had some measure of closure. I never returned to lighthouse keeping after that. Some places hold memories in their walls, echoes of violence and fear that refuse to fade. And not every death is an accident. If you ever take work in isolated places, know that you might not be as alone as you think, and the dead do not always rest quietly. I need to tell someone what happened at Raven's Cry Lighthouse because I cannot carry this alone anymore. I was working as assistant keeper during the winter of 2018, and I witnessed something that still makes me question reality itself. My name is Brielle, and before this experience, I considered myself a rational person, grounded in science and logic. I had studied marine biology in college and had always been drawn to the ocean, fascinated by its depth and mystery. When the opportunity came to work as an assistant lighthouse keeper on the Pacific Northwest coast, I jumped at it. The position offered hands-on experience with weather monitoring equipment and wildlife observation, both of which would benefit my career. I thought I understood the ocean. I thought I knew what lived in its depths and moved across its surface. I was wrong about everything. Raven's Cry Lighthouse stands on a jagged promontory of volcanic rock about 15 miles south of the Washington-Oregon border. Accessible only by helicopter or a treacherous boat landing that is only safe during calm seas. The lighthouse itself was built in 1903 after a series of devastating shipwrecks claimed over 200 lives in the span of 5 years. The local indigenous communities had warned against building shipping routes through that particular stretch of water, claiming it was a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where things that should not exist could cross over during certain conditions. The government ignored these warnings, as governments tend to do, and built the lighthouse as a solution to what they saw as a navigation problem rather than a spiritual one. I arrived at Raven's Cry in November, just as the winter storm season was beginning. The head keeper was a man in his late 50s named Whitman, a career lighthouse keeper who had spent over 30 years at various stations along the coast. He was quiet and methodical, the kind of man who measured his words carefully and never spoke unless he had something meaningful to say. During my first week, he taught me the routines of lighthouse keeping. Checking the automated beacon system twice daily, monitoring weather equipment, maintaining the generator, and keeping detailed logs of everything from barometric pressure to wildlife sightings. The work was physically demanding but satisfying, and I found myself falling into a comfortable rhythm alongside Whitman. The fishing communities in the nearest coastal town, a small place called Mercy Harbor about 20 miles north, had a strange relationship with Raven's Cry Lighthouse. When I went ashore for supplies during my second week, I stopped at a general store where an elderly woman working the counter asked me where I was stationed. When I told her Raven's Cry, her expression changed immediately. She leaned across the counter and said in a low voice, "You watch for the fog, girl. The fog that moves wrong. The fog that brings visitors." I asked her what she meant, but she would not elaborate, only shaking her head and bagging my groceries in silence. I mentioned this conversation to Whitman that evening, and he dismissed it with a wave of his hand, saying that coastal communities always had superstitions about lighthouses and that we should not pay attention to local folklore. But I could tell from the way his jaw tightened when I mentioned the fog that he knew more than he was saying. Winter on the Pacific Northwest coast is brutal in ways that people who have never experienced it cannot truly understand. The storms roll in from the ocean with a ferocity that seems almost alive. Waves reaching heights of 40 and 50 feet. Wind speeds that can tear metal from its moorings. We had weathered several significant storms during my first month at Raven's Cry, and I had grown accustomed to the violence of it. The way the lighthouse would shudder and groan, but ultimately stand firm against the assault. Whitman and I had developed an efficient partnership, moving through emergency protocols with practiced coordination whenever a major system rolled through. It was during a massive storm in mid-January that everything changed. The Weather Service had been tracking a low-pressure system for days, warning that it would be one of the most severe storms of the season. We prepared accordingly, securing everything that could be secured, checking backup systems and laying in extra supplies in case we were cut off from resupply for an extended period. The storm hit at dusk on a Friday, and within hours the wind was howling at over 90 miles per hour, driving rain so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown against the lighthouse walls. Around midnight, as the storm reached its peak intensity, something changed. I was in the equipment room checking the backup generator when I noticed through the narrow window that the quality of the darkness outside had shifted. Despite the rain and wind, I could see a fog rolling in from the ocean. But it was unlike any fog I had ever seen. It was thick and yellowish gray, with a texture that seemed almost solid, and it was moving against the wind. That should have been impossible. Fog is essentially a cloud at ground level, composed of water droplets suspended in air. And it moves with wind currents, not against them. But this fog was pushing inland directly into the teeth of the gale, as though it had its own propulsion. I called for Whitman, and he came immediately. When he looked out the window and saw the fog, all color drained from his face. Without a word, he began moving through the lighthouse, checking every door and window, ensuring everything was locked and sealed. I followed him, confused and increasingly frightened by his behavior. "What is happening?" I asked him. "What is that fog?" He did not answer me at first, just continued his inspection of the lighthouse's security. Finally, when every entrance was secured, he turned to me and said, "We are going to stay in the central corridor tonight. No one goes near the doors or windows. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, we do not open anything. Do you understand me?" I told him I did not understand, that he needed to explain what was happening. That is when he told me about what happened 5 years earlier, during his first winter at Raven's Cry. The same kind of fog had come during a storm, and the assistant keeper at that time, a young man fresh out of the Coast Guard, had seen something moving in the fog through the lantern room windows. Against Whitman's warnings, the young man had opened the lantern room door to get a better look. Whitman found him 3 days later on the rocks below the lighthouse, alive but completely catatonic. When they finally got him to a hospital, he remained unresponsive for 2 weeks. When he finally regained the ability to speak, he spoke only in a language that linguists could not identify, a series of clicking sounds and guttural syllables that did not match any known human language. He was eventually institutionalized, and as far as Whitman knew, he remained there still, never recovering his original language or memories. Before I could fully process what Whitman had told me, we heard the first scratching sounds on the exterior walls of the lighthouse. They started low, near the base of the structure. A sound like fingernails on stone, except amplified 1,000 times. The scratching moved upward, circling the lighthouse in a spiral pattern. Through the narrow window slits, I could see shapes moving in the yellow fog, tall and elongated, moving with a fluidity that did not match any animal I had ever studied. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then we heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A voice called my name. Not just any voice, but my grandmother's voice, clear and distinct. "Brielle, honey, open the door. I am so cold out here." My grandmother had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and hearing her voice, so perfectly replicated, speaking words she would have said, broke something in my mind. I moved toward the door without consciously deciding to do so, drawn by a need so powerful it overrode every rational thought. Whitman grabbed my arm, pulled me back, but I fought against him. The voice kept calling, "Brielle, please. It is so cold. I just want to come inside where it is warm. Do not you want to see me again?" I do not remember much of what happened next. Whitman told me later that I had nearly overpowered him, that I was screaming and clawing at the door, trying to get it open. He said I was speaking in a voice that did not sound like my own, saying things in that same clicking language the previous assistant keeper had used. He had to physically restrain me, and eventually he dragged me to the equipment room and locked me inside for my own safety. From inside that room, I could still hear the voices. Not just my grandmother now, but others. My mother, my college roommate who had died in a car accident, my high school boyfriend. All of them calling to me, all of them begging me to open the door, to let them in where it was warm and safe. And underneath their voices, I heard something else. A sound that was not quite laughter and not quite screaming. Something that made me understand on a primal level that whatever was out there was not human, had never been human, and wanted very badly to make me think otherwise. The scratching intensified until it sounded like the entire exterior of the lighthouse was being clawed by 1,000 hands. The beacon in the lantern room began to dim, the electrical system fluctuating despite having no mechanical reason to do so. Through the narrow window of the equipment room, I watched as the yellow fog pressed against the glass, and within it, I saw faces forming and dissolving, mouths opening impossibly wide, eyes that were just dark holes in pale flesh. Then something massive hit the main door with enough force to crack the heavy reinforced wood. I heard Whitman shouting, heard him dragging furniture to barricade the entrance. Another impact. The wood splintered. I pressed myself into the corner of the equipment room, sobbing, convinced that whatever was outside was going to get in and that we were going to die or worse. The assault continued for what felt like hours. Impact after impact against the door. The voices never stopped calling. The scratching never ceased. At some point, I passed out from sheer terror and exhaustion. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the window. The storm had passed. The fog was gone. I stumbled out of the equipment room to find Whitman sitting on the floor near the barricaded door, looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. Together, we carefully removed the barricade and opened the door. The sight that greeted us was something out of a nightmare. Every surface of the lighthouse exterior was covered in deep claw marks, gouges in the stone and metal that went down several inches. The marks were not consistent with any animal. They were too large, too deep, and too numerous. Some of them appeared to have been made by hands, with too many fingers. The door itself, 3 inches of reinforced wood and metal, had a crack running through it from top to bottom. We documented everything with photographs, but we both knew without discussing it that no one would believe us. We would be dismissed as having experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by isolation and storm stress. Whitman submitted his resignation that same day. I lasted another week before I could not take it anymore and requested an immediate transfer. The official report stated that the damage to the lighthouse was caused by debris thrown by the storm, and the cracked door was attributed to wind pressure and age. The lighthouse now requires a minimum of 3 keepers at all times. though the official reason given is operational efficiency. The doors have all been replaced with steel-reinforced versions that lock from the inside with heavy deadbolts. I transferred to an inland research station where I work with freshwater systems and never have to see the ocean. I still have nightmares about that night, about the yellow fog and the voices calling my name. Sometimes I wake up speaking in that clicking language, words forming on my tongue that I do not understand. Whitman and I exchange emails occasionally, but we never discuss what happened. There is nothing to say. We both know what we experienced, and we both know that the ocean keeps its secrets. But sometimes, those secrets come looking for witnesses. If you ever take work near the water, trust the warnings of people who have lived there their entire lives. Some knowledge is passed down through generations for a reason. And some doors should never be opened, no matter who is calling your name from the other side. Back in 2015, I took a winter contract at Northwatch Lighthouse because I needed money and did not mind isolation. What I found there still wakes me up at night, and I have never told anyone the complete truth about what happened. My name is Declan, and before I accepted that position, I was working construction jobs across the Northern Territories, moving from site to site, barely making enough to cover my debts. When a recruiter contacted me about an emergency replacement position at an Arctic lighthouse, offering 3 times my usual pay for a 3-month commitment, I did not hesitate. I should have asked why they were so desperate to fill the position. I should have questioned why the previous keeper had left so abruptly that they needed someone immediately, regardless of experience. But I was broke and desperate, and desperation makes you ignore warning signs that would otherwise seem obvious. The recruiter explained that the previous keeper, a man named Boyd, had been evacuated for medical reasons, and that I would be taking over his duties until a permanent replacement could be found. Northwatch Lighthouse sits on a barren rock island about 40 miles off the northern coast of Alaska, one of the most remote lighthouse stations still in operation. During winter, the island is completely cut off from the mainland, except for emergency helicopter evacuations and monthly supply drops, weather permitting. The lighthouse itself was built in 1937 to guide ships through the treacherous waters of the Bering Strait, and it has been continuously manned ever since, despite multiple attempts to automate it. The harsh conditions and frequent equipment failures made human oversight necessary, even in the modern age. I arrived at Northwatch in mid-December during a blizzard that nearly prevented the helicopter from landing. The pilot dropped me and my supplies on the landing pad and took off immediately, clearly eager to leave before conditions worsened. I watched the helicopter disappear into the swirling snow and felt the first real stab of fear. The isolation was absolute. There was nothing but ice, rock, and the lighthouse towering above me, its beam cutting through the white darkness every 10 seconds. I gathered my supplies and made my way to the entrance, a heavy steel door that had been left unlocked for my arrival. The interior of Northwatch was exactly what I expected. Functional, sparse, and cold, despite the heating system running at full capacity. The living quarters consisted of a small kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a common area with a radio for communication with the mainland. The lighthouse tower rose above the living quarters, accessed by a narrow stairwell that led up to the beacon room. Everything was clean and organized, but there was something unsettling about the place that I could not immediately identify. It felt abandoned in a way that went beyond the previous keeper's departure, as though no one had truly lived there in years. I spent my first 2 days settling in and familiarizing myself with the equipment and routines. The work was straightforward. Monitor the beacon, check weather instruments, maintain the generator, and report conditions to the mainland twice daily via radio. The isolation did not bother me initially. I had spent months at remote construction sites and was accustomed to my own company. But on my third night at Northwatch, while organizing supplies in the storage room, I discovered something that changed everything. Behind a loose panel in the storage room wall, I found a journal. The handwriting on the cover identified it as belonging to Boyd, the keeper I had replaced. I knew immediately that I should not read it, that whatever was written inside was private and likely the reason Boyd had left so abruptly. But curiosity and the desperate boredom of isolation overrode my better judgment. I took the journal to my bedroom and began reading. The early entries were mundane, typical observations about weather and routine maintenance. But after the first month, Boyd's tone began to change. He wrote about hearing his name being called from outside the lighthouse, always at night, always when the wind was at its strongest. At first, he assumed it was an auditory hallucination caused by the wind whistling through the rocks, a common phenomenon in harsh environments. But the calling persisted, and Boyd began to notice other things. Footprints would appear in the snow around the lighthouse, circling the building in perfect rings, even though Boyd had not gone outside. The footprints were always there in the morning, fresh despite the constant snowfall that should have buried them. Boyd's entries grew increasingly paranoid. He wrote about feeling watched, about hearing movement in the lower levels of the lighthouse, about being convinced that someone else was living in the building with him. He described lying awake at night, listening to breathing sounds that came from inside the walls, rhythmic and slow, as though something large was sleeping just beyond the stone and metal. The final entry, dated just 3 days before my arrival, was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and desperate. I can hear them in the basement. I know someone is down there. The basement that is not supposed to exist. I am going to find the entrance tonight. If I do not make it back, tell my sister I love her. I sat in my bed, the journal trembling in my hands, and felt ice form in my stomach. According to the building plans I'd been given during my briefing, Northwatch Lighthouse had no basement. The structure was built directly on bedrock, with the living quarters at ground level and the tower extending upward. There should not have been any lower levels, but Boyd had found something, and it had frightened him enough to request emergency evacuation. I should have reported the journal immediately. I should have contacted the mainland and asked for clarification. But part of me, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and hidden things, needed to know what Boyd had found. I waited until morning, then began a systematic search of the lower level, looking for any entrance or access point that might lead to a basement or sub-level. It took me most of the day, but I finally found it. A small hatch in the floor of the equipment room, hidden beneath a storage locker that had not been moved in years. The hatch was secured with a simple latch, not locked, as though whoever built it had never expected anyone to need to keep people out. I pulled the hatch open and shone my flashlight down into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. A ladder descended about 15 feet into what appeared to be a natural cavern that had been incorporated into the lighthouse's foundation. I should not have gone down. Every instinct I had screamed at me to close that hatch and forget I had ever found it. But I descended the ladder, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and found myself in a rough stone chamber about 20 feet across. The walls were natural rock, but someone had clearly been using this space. In one corner, I found a makeshift camp. Old blankets, empty food cans, a small camping stove, and personal items scattered about. Someone had been living down here, hiding in the depths of the lighthouse, existing in secret beneath the feet of the keepers above. And then I saw him. In the far corner of the chamber, propped against the wall, was a body. The Arctic cold had preserved it perfectly, freezing it in place like a grotesque statue. The man was dressed in clothing from the 1970s, faded jeans and a heavy jacket, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His hands were extended in front of him, as though he had been trying to ward something off, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering wildly, and nearly fell. My mind was racing, trying to understand what I was seeing. This was not some recent death. This man had been down here for decades, frozen and forgotten. How had no one found him? How had he gotten down here in the first place? And more terrifying than any of those questions was the realization that someone had known he was down here. Someone had sealed him in this chamber and left him to die in the darkness. I climbed out of that chamber faster than I had ever moved in my life, slamming the hatch closed behind me and dragging the storage locker back over it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the radio, but I managed to contact the mainland and report what I had found. The official response was confusion and disbelief. According to all records, no keeper had ever gone missing from Northwatch Lighthouse. But I knew what I had seen, and I demanded an immediate investigation. It took 3 days for investigators to arrive, weather preventing any earlier landing. During those 3 days, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds from below, movement in that sealed chamber as though whatever had killed that man was still down there, stirring. On the second night, I heard footsteps moving through the lighthouse, heavy and deliberate, and I barricaded myself in my bedroom with every piece of furniture I could move. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard breathing, deep and wet, right on the other side of the thin wood. Then a voice, old and cracked, said words I will never forget. I finally kept him quiet. Took so long, but I finally did it. Now he cannot tell anyone what I did. When the investigators finally arrived, they found everything exactly as I had described. The body was identified through dental records as Spencer Holt, a lighthouse keeper who had been reported missing in 1979. He had been presumed to have walked out onto the ice during a mental breakdown and drowned when the ice gave way. But Holt had never left the lighthouse. He had been locked in that sub-basement and left to die of exposure and starvation. The investigation revealed that the keeper who had reported Holt missing, a man named Ferguson, had a violent history that had been covered up by the Maritime Authority. Ferguson had been disciplined multiple times for assaulting other keepers, but he had connections within the organization that protected him. According to records that were eventually uncovered, Ferguson had accused Holt of sabotaging equipment and had claimed Holt was mentally unstable. When Holt disappeared, Ferguson's story was accepted without serious investigation. Ferguson continued working as a lighthouse keeper for another 4 years before dying of a heart attack in 1983. But on my final night at Northwatch, before the relief keeper arrived to permanently staff the lighthouse, I saw something that still defies explanation. I was in the beacon room, conducting my final equipment check, when I saw a figure standing at the base of the tower. It was an elderly man, hunched and frail, staring up at the lighthouse with an expression of malevolent satisfaction. He looked exactly like the photographs I had been shown of Ferguson. He raised one hand in a mocking wave, and then he vanished, simply ceased to exist as though he had never been there at all. Northwatch Lighthouse was decommissioned 6 months later. The official reason given was operational costs and advances in GPS technology, making manned lighthouses obsolete. But I know the real reason. Some places hold evil in their foundations, and some crimes stain a location so deeply that the only solution is abandonment. Isolation can hide terrible things, and not every missing person walks away willingly. Some disappearances are not mysteries. They are cover-ups, and the dead do not always rest quietly. when injustice remains unresolved. 5 years ago, I was stationed at Greystone Lighthouse during hurricane season, and what washed ashore during that storm still has no explanation. The authorities told me to never speak about it, but I think people deserve to know what is out there. My name is Piper, and I had been working as a lighthouse keeper for nearly 8 years when I was assigned to Greystone, a remote station on the Atlantic coast about 60 miles south of Cape Hatteras. I was not some inexperienced novice, frightened by isolation or strange ocean phenomena. I had weathered countless storms, witnessed bizarre marine events, and learned to distinguish between natural occurrences and genuine anomalies. I considered myself an expert in my field, someone who understood the ocean and respected its power, but was not intimidated by it. That confidence, that certainty that I had seen everything the sea could offer, was shattered in a single night. Greystone Lighthouse was built in 1892 on a barrier island that had been slowly eroding for decades. By the time I was stationed there, the lighthouse stood only about 200 yards from the high tide line, close enough that during severe storms, the waves would crash against the foundation. There had been talk of relocating or decommissioning the structure, but it remained operational, guiding ships through one of the most treacherous stretches of the Atlantic shipping lanes. The lighthouse itself was elegant in its simplicity, a white octagonal tower rising 140 feet above the sand, with keeper's quarters built into the base. I lived there alone during my rotation, which suited me perfectly. Solitude had always been my preference, and the rhythmic pulse of the ocean was better company than most people I had known. Hurricane season along the Atlantic coast is a time of constant vigilance. We track systems as they form off the African coast, watching them grow and strengthen as they move west across warm waters. In September of that year, a Category 3 hurricane named Ophelia was bearing down on the coast, and all indicators suggested it would pass within 50 miles of Greystone. I had been through hurricanes before, knew the protocols, and had confidence in the lighthouse's ability to withstand the storm. I secured everything that could be secured, checked and rechecked the backup generator, and settled in to wait out the weather. The storm was expected to make its closest approach around midnight, with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour and storm surge potentially reaching 15 feet. Ophelia arrived right on schedule. By 11 in the evening, the wind was screaming like something alive, and rain was coming down so hard it was nearly horizontal. I was monitoring conditions from the equipment room, watching the anemometer readings climb higher and higher, when I heard something that should not have been possible over the roar of the storm. A massive impact sound, metal on rock, came from the ocean side of the lighthouse. It was not the crash of a wave or the sound of debris being thrown by the wind. It was deliberate, heavy, and it resonated through the foundation of the building like a bell being struck. I waited for dawn, knowing that venturing outside during the height of a hurricane would be suicide. The wind and storm surge would sweep me off the rocks before I made it 10 feet from the door. But as soon as the first gray light appeared and the wind dropped below 50 miles per hour, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and went outside to assess damage. What I found on the rocks below the lighthouse made absolutely no sense. Wedged between two large boulders, partially submerged in the receding tide, was a metal cylinder approximately 8 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. It was covered in barnacles and marine growth, suggesting it had been in the ocean for some time. But there was no rust, no corrosion, no degradation of the metal itself. The surface was smooth and dark, almost black, with a faint iridescence like oil on water. But what made my heart rate accelerate were the symbols etched into the surface. They covered the entire cylinder in precise geometric patterns, and they were not from any language or system of notation I recognized. I have seen maritime symbols from dozens of cultures, ancient and modern, but these were something else entirely. They reminded me vaguely of circuit boards or mathematical formulas, but rendered in a way that seemed almost organic. As I approached the cylinder, I became aware of a sound, a low humming, barely audible over the wind and waves, emanating from inside the object. It was steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat or a machine operating at low power. I reached out to touch it, and the metal was warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding water and air. That was when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I pulled out my phone and took several photographs from multiple angles, documenting everything I could see before I reported the find. I contacted the Coast Guard on the emergency radio frequency, explaining that an unidentified object had washed ashore during the storm, and that it appeared to be man-made, but unlike anything in my experience. The response was immediate and alarming. They asked me to repeat my description twice, asked specific questions about the symbols and the humming sound, and then told me to return to the lighthouse and wait. They did not say wait for what or how long. They just said wait. Within 3 hours, helicopters arrived. Not Coast Guard helicopters, but military aircraft, unmarked except for tail numbers. Men in tactical gear deployed onto the beach, and they moved with the precision of special operations personnel. They established a perimeter around the object immediately, and 2 men in different uniforms, darker and without any identifying insignia, approached me where I stood near the lighthouse entrance. The questioning was intense. They wanted to know exactly when I had found the object, whether I had touched it, whether anyone else knew about it, and whether I had taken any photographs or video. I lied about the photographs. Some instinct told me that admitting to having documentation would result in those photographs being confiscated, and I wanted to have something, some proof of what I had witnessed. They seemed satisfied with my answers and told me to remain inside the lighthouse while they worked. From the equipment room window, I watched them for hours. They had brought specialized equipment, devices that they held near the cylinder, taking readings that made them gesture animatedly to each other. At one point, I saw one of the men speaking urgently into a satellite phone, and whatever he heard in response made him turn and look directly at the lighthouse, directly at the window where I was standing. I stepped back instinctively, feeling exposed despite the distance. By late afternoon, a large military transport helicopter arrived, carrying what appeared to be a specialized container. The divers went into the water and attached rigging to the cylinder, and they lifted it out with precision, placing it carefully into the container. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes, and then they were preparing to leave. That was when the man in the dark uniform came to speak with me again. He was polite but firm. He explained that what I had found was weather monitoring equipment from an experimental program, that it had broken free from its moorings during the storm, and that its recovery was classified for national security reasons. He thanked me for my cooperation and asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which was really not a request at all. The document was vague, stating only that I agreed not to discuss classified equipment or operations with any unauthorized personnel. I signed it because I understood that refusing was not actually an option. Before he left, the man looked at me for a long moment and said something I will never forget. He said, "You found weather equipment. That is the only thing you found. It would be unfortunate if you suffered an accident or lost your keeper's license over misremembering events. People who work in isolated locations need to be reliable and stable. We would hate to have concerns about your reliability." It was not a direct threat, but the implication was crystal clear. Speak about this and there would be consequences. They left as quickly as they had arrived, and I was alone again on the beach with nothing but disturbed sand and my own racing thoughts. That night, I checked my phone for the photographs I had taken. Every single one was corrupted, showing only gray static. I checked my backup cloud storage, my computer, every device I had. The photographs had deleted themselves, or more likely, someone had remotely wiped them while I was distracted. The only proof I had that any of it had happened was my own memory and the disturbed sand on the beach that would be smoothed away by the next tide. I kept my position at Greystone for another 2 months, finishing my contracted rotation, but I transferred to an inland station as soon as I could. The ocean no longer felt like something I understood. It felt like something that held secrets I was not meant to discover. And every time I looked at the horizon, I wondered what else was out there beneath the waves. 3 years later, I was watching a documentary about unidentified submersible objects, phenomena that Navy vessels and research ships have been recording for decades. Objects that move underwater at speeds that should not be possible, that appear on sonar and then vanish, that seem to defy our understanding of physics and engineering. At one point, the documentary showed grainy footage of symbols that had been recorded from one of these objects. They were identical to the symbols I had seen on the cylinder at Greystone. I contacted the documentary producers, offering to share my experience, but I received no response. I tried reaching out to researchers who study these phenomena, but no one would return my calls or emails. The ocean hides things governments do not want found, and some discoveries come with consequences. Not everything that washes ashore is meant for civilian eyes, and not every mystery will be solved. If you work near the water, understand that you may witness things you will never be allowed to discuss, and that the truth is often buried under layers of official denial. What I found that night was real, and somewhere in a classified facility, that cylinder sits in storage, its purpose and origin known only to a select few who will never share what they know. I worked at Blackwater Lighthouse for 2 seasons, and I learned why they have the 3-day rule. No keeper stays alone longer than 3 days. I am the reason that rule exists, and I have to live with what I did. My name is Hayden, and before my experience at Blackwater, I considered myself unshakable. I had served 4 years in the Coast Guard, worked on deep-sea fishing vessels in the Bering Sea, and spent 18 months as a solo keeper at a remote weather station in the Aleutian Islands. Isolation did not frighten me. In fact, I preferred it to the complications of social interaction and the noise of civilization. When I was offered a position at Blackwater Lighthouse, a station known for its harsh conditions and high turnover rate, I accepted immediately. The pay was good, the work was straightforward, and I would be left alone to do my job without interference. It seemed perfect. Blackwater Lighthouse sits on a rocky island about 30 miles off the coast of Maine, in an area where the Atlantic currents create dangerous riptides and unpredictable weather patterns. The lighthouse has been in continuous operation since 1874, and it has a reputation among maritime workers as a difficult posting. Most keepers serve their contracted period and request immediate transfer. Some leave before their contracts are complete, citing personal emergencies or health issues. The Maritime Authority attributed the high turnover to the harsh weather and extreme isolation. But there were rumors among the keeper community that Blackwater was different somehow. That something about the place affected people in ways that were difficult to articulate. During my initial briefing, the regional supervisor mentioned almost casually that there was a 3-day rule at Blackwater. Keepers were required to work in pairs, and no individual was permitted to remain alone at the lighthouse for longer than 72 consecutive hours. If a keeper's partner needed to leave for any reason, a replacement had to arrive within 3 days, or the remaining keeper was required to evacuate as well. When I asked why this rule existed, the supervisor became vague, mentioning something about psychological studies showing that extended isolation could affect judgment and decision-making. It sounded like bureaucratic nonsense to me, the kind of policy created by people who had never actually worked in isolated environments and did not understand that some people thrived in solitude. In December of 2016, my partner keeper requested emergency leave to attend to a family crisis. His father had suffered a stroke, and he needed to return to the mainland immediately. The Maritime Authority scrambled to find a replacement, but a winter storm system was moving through the region, and helicopter transport was grounded. They estimated it would take 4 to 5 days before conditions improved enough to bring in a relief keeper. The supervisor asked if I would be comfortable staying alone at Blackwater until then, with the understanding that if I felt uncomfortable at any point, I could trigger the emergency beacon and they would evacuate me as soon as weather permitted. I agreed without hesitation. In fact, I volunteered enthusiastically. I would earn a significant bonus for the extended solo duty, and I genuinely looked forward to having the lighthouse entirely to myself. The other keepers warned me against it. One man, someone who had worked at Blackwater years earlier, pulled me aside and said something strange. He told me that a previous keeper named Quinn had broken the 3-day rule and had to be institutionalized afterward. He said Quinn had been found wandering the rocks around the lighthouse, speaking to people who were not there, completely detached from reality. But I dismissed these warnings as superstition and the paranoia of people who were not cut out for true isolation. The first 3 days alone at Blackwater were exactly what I had hoped for. I established efficient routines, completed maintenance tasks that had been neglected, and enjoyed the profound silence that comes with being truly alone. I slept well, ate regularly, and felt more centered than I had in months. On the morning of day 4, I woke feeling completely normal, made coffee, and began my equipment checks. Everything seemed fine until that evening when I was preparing dinner and realized that every light in the lighthouse was on, despite the fact that I had turned them all off before going to bed the previous night. Every single light in the keeper's quarters, the stairwell, the lantern room, everything was blazing. I told myself I must have forgotten to turn them off, that I had been tired and made a mistake. But I knew that was not true. I had distinct memories of going through the lighthouse, room by room, shutting off lights as I always did before bed. Still, there was no other explanation that made sense. I turned off all the lights again, carefully and deliberately, and went to bed. On the morning of day 5, every light was on again. This time, I checked the security camera system that monitored the lighthouse interior. I scrolled back through the footage from the previous night and felt my blood run cold. The cameras had recorded me walking through the lighthouse at 3:15 in the morning, methodically turning on every light. I watched myself on the grainy footage, moving with purpose, my face blank and expressionless. I had absolutely no memory of doing this. I had been asleep, or so I thought, but the evidence was undeniable. I had been sleepwalking, something I had never done in my entire life. That discovery should have been enough to make me trigger the emergency beacon and request evacuation. But I convinced myself it was just stress, a temporary phenomenon that would pass. I was embarrassed by the idea of admitting I could not handle a few extra days of isolation, that I was somehow weaker than I had believed myself to be. So I stayed. Day 6 was when things became truly frightening. I woke up in the afternoon, which was unusual because I typically rose early. My body ached in ways that suggested intense physical activity. but I could not remember doing anything strenuous. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, I discovered bruises on my arms and shoulders, dark purple marks that looked like someone had grabbed me forcefully. I had no memory of injuring myself. I checked the security footage again and found hours of recorded activity that I had no recollection of whatsoever. The footage showed me in the lantern room in the middle of the night, pacing in circles, stopping periodically to stare out at the ocean. At one point, I saw myself approach the glass and press my hands against it, leaning forward as though trying to push through. Then I watched myself go to the equipment room and begin taking tools off the wall. I carried a hammer and a pry bar up to the keeper's quarters and began striking the walls, hitting the same spot repeatedly, creating a hole in the plaster. After several minutes of this, I stopped, returned the tools, and went back to bed. I found the hole in the wall exactly where the footage showed it would be. But the most disturbing part of the footage was the moment when I paused in the middle of pacing and turned to look directly at the security camera. My face was completely blank, my eyes unfocused, but my mouth was moving. I increased the volume and heard myself speaking in a low monotone, saying the same phrases over and over. They want out. I can hear them in the walls. I need to break the walls. They want out. I checked the lighthouse maintenance log, which I had been keeping meticulously since arriving. There were entries in my handwriting that I did not remember writing, scattered among my normal daily notes. The entries were disturbing. The walls are too thick. I need more time. They're getting louder. And if I could just break through, I could let them out. They have been trapped for so long. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing these words. I did not believe anyone was trapped in the walls. I was not hearing voices. At least, I did not think I was. That night, day 7 of my isolation, I decided I would trigger the emergency beacon in the morning. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, pushing the dresser against the door, and tried to stay awake. I was terrified of what I might do if I fell asleep, what the sleepwalking version of myself might be capable of. But exhaustion eventually overcame fear, and I drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up standing on the exterior gallery railing, 120 feet above the rocks, with my toes hanging over the edge. The wind was blowing hard, and I was gripping the lighthouse rail with one hand while the other reached out into empty space. One step forward, and I would have plunged to my death. The terror that flooded through me when I realized where I was and what I was about to do gave me enough shock to step backward onto the gallery floor. I scrambled to the door, threw myself inside, and triggered the emergency beacon immediately. The rescue helicopter arrived 8 hours later. During those 8 hours, I did not sleep. I did not let myself close my eyes. I sat in the equipment room with every light blazing and the security monitor in front of me so I could watch myself, so I would know if I started to move. When the rescue crew arrived, they found me in a state of complete psychological collapse, shaking and unable to articulate what had happened. The psychiatric evaluation that followed found no underlying mental illness, no psychotic disorder, no explanation for the extreme dissociative episodes I had experienced. But the psychiatrist noted that I had experienced complete personality dissociation, a state in which a part of my consciousness had taken control of my body while my conscious mind was essentially offline. He could not explain why it had happened or why it had stopped once I left the lighthouse. I learned later that 12 keepers had died at Blackwater Lighthouse since its construction in 1874. Every single death occurred between day 4 and day 7 of a solo shift. Some were ruled suicides, others accidents. But the pattern was undeniable. The Maritime Authority had known about it for decades, but had never officially acknowledged it. The 3-day rule was implemented quietly after a keeper died in 1998, but it was never explained properly, never enforced strictly enough. After my incident, the rules changed. Blackwater Lighthouse now requires a minimum of 2 keepers at all times, and individual shifts are limited to 3 days maximum. An investigation into the lighthouse revealed abnormally high electromagnetic readings from outdated equipment that had been in place since the lighthouse's construction. The equipment was replaced, but the damage to the keepers who had been exposed over the years could not be undone. Some safety rules exist because people died learning them. Extended isolation in certain places can break your mind in ways you cannot predict or control. Whatever happened to me at Blackwater, whether it was electromagnetic interference affecting my brain function or something else entirely, I know that I came within 1 step of death. I know that something in that lighthouse wanted me to die, or wanted to use me to free something that should never be released. I will never work in an isolated lighthouse again, and I will never dismiss safety protocols as unnecessary bureaucracy. The 3-day rule exists for a reason, and I am living proof of what happens when that rule is broken. Growing up in a lighthouse keeper family, I heard the stories about the woman in the water. I thought they were myths to scare new keepers. Then I took my first solo watch at Widow's Point Lighthouse, and I learned some myths are memories. My name is Quinn, and I am a 3rd-generation lighthouse keeper. My grandfather kept lights along the New England coast for 40 years, and my father followed in his footsteps for another 30. I grew up hearing their stories, learning their trade, and understanding that lighthouse keeping was not just a job, but a calling, a tradition passed down through generations. The ocean was in my blood, and I knew from childhood that I would spend my life at the edge of the world, keeping the lights burning for ships that passed in the darkness. Widow's Point Lighthouse stands on a rocky promontory jutting into the Atlantic about 12 miles south of Portland, Maine. It was built in 1847 after a series of devastating shipwrecks claimed over 100 lives in a single winter. The lighthouse has a dark history, one that every local fisherman knows, but outsiders rarely hear. In 1849, a keeper named Joseph Delaney was stationed at Widow's Point with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young children. That winter, Joseph received word that the ship carrying his brother and nephew had gone down in a storm. Joseph had been on duty when the ship passed, but he had failed to spot the vessel's distress signals in time. By the time rescue ships reached the wreck, everyone aboard was dead. Joseph fell into a deep depression, blaming himself for the deaths. According to the historical accounts, Sarah tried to comfort him, but his guilt consumed him. 3 weeks after receiving the news, Joseph walked out onto the ice during a blizzard and never returned. His body was found days later, frozen in the water a mile from shore. Sarah Delaney never recovered from the loss. She remained at Widow's Point with her children, taking over her husband's duties as keeper, determined to prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. But the isolation and grief were too much. 6 months after Joseph's death, Sarah's children both died of influenza during a harsh winter storm that prevented any medical assistance from reaching the lighthouse. Sarah buried them herself on the rocks near the lighthouse. A week later, during another storm, Sarah was seen by a passing ship standing on the rocks below the lighthouse in her white nightgown, staring out at the sea. The next morning, her body was found in the water at the base of the cliffs. The official report called it an accidental drowning, but everyone who knew her understood it was suicide. Sarah had thrown herself into the ocean, unable to bear the weight of her losses. For over 170 years, fishermen and sailors have reported seeing a woman in white standing on the rocks near Widow's Point during storms. They call her Sarah, Delaney, or simply the Woman in White. And there is a superstition among the maritime community that when she appears, someone will die at sea within 3 days unless her warning is heeded. My grandfather saw her twice during his career, and both times, he told me, ships were saved because he had been extra vigilant in watching for vessels in distress. My father saw her once, and he managed to spot a fishing boat whose engine had failed in heavy seas, directing rescue efforts that saved 4 lives. They both spoke of her with respect, even reverence, believing that Sarah's spirit remained at Widow's Point, trying to prevent the kind of tragedy that had destroyed her family. I took my first solo keeper position at Widow's Point in the fall of 2017. I was 28 years old and eager to prove myself capable of handling the responsibilities my father and grandfather had carried with such skill. The position had been difficult to fill because of the lighthouse's reputation, but I viewed the stories about Sarah Delaney as family folklore, comforting tales that gave meaning to the difficult work of lighthouse keeping. I did not truly believe in ghosts or supernatural warnings. I believed in vigilance, preparation, and the power of human dedication to save lives. I thought the stories were just stories. My first storm at Widow's Point came in early November, a powerful nor'easter that brought wind gusts over 70 miles per hour and waves that crashed against the base of the lighthouse with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. I was monitoring weather conditions and radio traffic, maintaining constant communication with the Coast Guard about shipping activity in the area. The storm was expected to last through the night, and several vessels had already diverted to safer waters or returned to port. I was preparing coffee in the keeper's quarters around midnight when I glanced out the window toward the rocks below. She was standing there, exactly as my grandfather had described. A woman in a white dress, her hair loose and flowing in the wind that should have torn her clothing and knocked her off her feet. But she stood perfectly still, untouched by the storm, staring out at the black ocean. Her dress glowed faintly in the darkness, as though lit from within. I felt my heart stop. Every rational explanation fled my mind, and I was left with the undeniable reality that I was looking at something that should not exist. I grabbed binoculars with shaking hands and focused on the figure. Her face was pale and beautiful, with an expression of profound sadness. She was not looking at the lighthouse or at me. She was staring fixedly at a point on the horizon, her hand raised as though pointing toward something I could not see. I tried to follow her gaze, scanning the dark water with my binoculars, but I could see nothing beyond the waves and storm. Then I remembered what my grandfather had told me. If you see her, she is showing you where to look. She is warning you that someone needs help. I immediately returned to the radio and contacted the Coast Guard, informing them that I had reason to believe a vessel might be in distress to the north of Widow's Point, even though I had no concrete evidence. The operator was skeptical, but protocol required them to investigate any potential distress situation. They dispatched a helicopter to search the area I indicated. For the next 2 hours, I maintained constant watch on the northern waters, straining my eyes against the darkness and storm. The woman remained on the rocks below, still pointing, still staring. Then, at 2:30 in the morning, I spotted it through my telescope. A faint emergency strobe light, barely visible between the waves. A pleasure yacht had lost engine power and was drifting dangerously close to a reef system that would tear it apart. I immediately reported the sighting, and Coast Guard rescue helicopters were diverted to the location. The rescue took 3 hours, but all 4 people aboard the yacht were saved. When I looked back down at the rocks, the woman was gone. I went outside at dawn, after the storm had passed, and searched the rocks where she had been standing. There were no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had seen, and more importantly, I knew that 4 people were alive because of the warning she had given. I saw Sarah Delaney 2 more times during my tenure at Widow's Point. The second time was during a winter storm when a cargo ship's navigation system failed, and they were heading directly toward shallow waters. Her appearance prompted me to contact the vessel and warn them of the danger, preventing what would have been a catastrophic grounding. The third time was during a dense fog when a small fishing boat's radio failed. I only spotted them because I had been scanning the exact area where Sarah had been pointing, seeing their visual distress signals that would otherwise have been invisible in the fog. I have now been keeping lights for 11 years, and I consider Sarah Delaney to be my most reliable partner in the work of saving lives at sea. Other keepers at Widow's Point have reported seeing her as well, though she does not appear to everyone. My father believes she only reveals herself to keepers who will act on her warnings, those who will take the risk of seeming foolish or paranoid in order to potentially save lives. I have come to understand that her appearances are not hauntings in the traditional sense. She is not trapped or suffering. She has chosen to remain, to continue the work she started when she took over her husband's duties after his death. She is still trying to prevent other families from experiencing the loss that destroyed her own. The maritime community in this region knows about Sarah. When I mention seeing her to veteran sailors, they nod with understanding and respect. They tell their own stories of near misses and unexplained warnings that saved their lives. The woman in white is part of the living folklore of these waters, a presence that is accepted and even welcomed by those who understand what she represents. I know that to most people, this story will sound like the delusion of someone who has spent too long in isolation, someone whose mind has created comforting explanations for coincidence and chance. But I have seen her with my own eyes on 3 separate occasions, and each time her warning has led directly to lives being saved. I have spoken with other keepers who have had identical experiences. The evidence may be anecdotal, but it is consistent and compelling. Not every ghost is malevolent, and some legends carry truth that protects the living. The dead sometimes watch over the places where they suffered most, trying to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. Sarah Delaney lost everything she loved to the sea and to the failures of lighthouse keeping. She spent the rest of her life trying to make amends, and apparently, death has not ended her vigil. I am honored to work alongside her, to be worthy of her trust, and to help her continue the mission she began over 170 years ago. If you ever find yourself at sea near Widow's Point and you see a woman in white standing on the rocks during a storm, do not dismiss her as imagination or superstition. She is showing you where to look, warning you of danger that may not yet be visible. Heed her warning, and you might save a life or your own. In December 2019, I was stranded at Stormbreak Lighthouse for 19 days when my relief keeper never arrived. By the time rescue came, I had made a discovery that explained why no one wanted to work there anymore, and why my predecessor MacArthur vanished without a trace. My name is Jace, and I was working as a temporary keeper, covering a staff shortage during the winter season. I had taken the position because I needed money quickly, and lighthouse work paid well for short-term contracts. Stormbreak Lighthouse sits on a rocky island about 8 miles off the coast of Northern California, a notorious posting that had seen 7 keepers quit in the previous 18 months. The Maritime Authority was desperate enough that they were accepting anyone with basic qualifications and a willingness to endure the isolation. The briefing I received before deployment was minimal at best. A harried supervisor in a regional office spent maybe 20 minutes going over basic procedures, handed me an equipment manual, and assured me that my 14-day rotation would pass quickly. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the previous keeper, a man named MacArthur, had left abruptly after only 6 days, citing family emergency. When I asked if MacArthur had left any notes or observations that might be useful, the supervisor said everything had been removed with his personal effects and that I would be starting fresh. There was something in his tone, a forced casualness, that made me wonder what he was not telling me. But I needed the money, and I had already signed the contract, so I did not press for details. I arrived at Stormbreak on a cold morning in early December, dropped off by supply boat along with provisions for my 2-week stay. The lighthouse was exactly what I expected. Functional but worn, with the kind of institutional bleakness that comes from decades of minimal maintenance and high turnover. The living quarters were clean enough, the equipment seemed operational, and the beacon was functioning normally. I spent my first day familiarizing myself with the layout, checking systems, and establishing my routines. Everything seemed straightforward until I received the radio call on day 8. A major storm system was tracking toward the coast, and the supply boat that was supposed to bring my relief keeper could not depart until conditions improved. The supervisor apologized and said they would get someone out to me as soon as the weather cleared, probably another 3 or 4 days at most. I was not thrilled about the delay, but I had weathered storms before and had adequate supplies. I told them it was fine and settled in to wait. By day 12, communications with the mainland had become sporadic due to the storm interfering with radio signals. I was told relief was still delayed, but should arrive within 48 hours. Then on day 13, the radio failed completely. I spent hours trying to repair it, working through every troubleshooting procedure in the manual. But something in the system had burned out and I did not have the parts to fix it. I was completely cut off, dependent on the storm clearing and someone on the mainland realizing I had lost communication. The isolation began to wear on me in ways I had not anticipated. The constant sound of wind and waves, the gray darkness that seemed to press against the windows, the absolute absence of any human contact. I tried to maintain my routines, but without the radio checks that normally structured my days, time began to feel strange and elastic. I would look at my watch and realize that hours had passed while I sat staring out the window, unable to account for where that time had gone. On day 14, when my rotation should have ended, I began exploring parts of the lighthouse I had not thoroughly investigated before. There were storage rooms in the lower level that I had not needed to access, areas that were not part of my regular maintenance rounds. I was looking for anything that might help repair the radio, or at least give me something productive to do while I waited for rescue. In one of the storage rooms, behind boxes of old equipment and spare parts, I found a locked metal cabinet. The lock was rusted but not particularly secure, and I managed to force it open with a screwdriver. Inside the cabinet, I found personal items that clearly belonged to the previous keeper, MacArthur. There was a phone, still in a waterproof case, a wallet containing identification and credit cards, car keys, a watch. These were not things someone would voluntarily leave behind if they were evacuating for a family emergency. These were essentials, the kinds of items people carry with them always. I pulled out the phone and saw that the screen was cracked, and there were dark stains on the case that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I found a charging cable and plugged the phone into the lighthouse electrical system, my hands shaking slightly as I waited for it to power on. It took several minutes, but eventually the screen lit up. The phone was not password protected, and I immediately went to the photo gallery. What I found there sent ice through my veins. MacArthur had recorded a series of videos, apparently using the phone to document something he had discovered. The first video showed him speaking directly to the camera, his face pale and his eyes wide. His voice was shaking as he said, "I have been hearing things. Movement in the walls. Footsteps in parts of the lighthouse where no one should be. I thought I was going crazy until I found the access point. Someone else is here. Someone has been living in this lighthouse, hiding in spaces I did not even know existed." The next video was recorded at night, the camera showing a narrow corridor I did not recognize, lit only by MacArthur's flashlight. His breathing was labored as he whispered, "I am in the hidden passage behind the north wall. It runs parallel to the main structure. There are supplies down here, food, water, blankets. Someone has been living here for months, maybe longer." The camera swung to show a makeshift camp, exactly as he had described. The final video was dated the day MacArthur supposedly left for his family emergency. The video showed him barricading the door to his sleeping quarters, stacking furniture against it while he spoke rapidly to the camera. "He tried to get in last night. I heard him at the door, trying the handle, scratching at the wood. I did not sleep. I cannot sleep. He is still here, somewhere in the lighthouse. I have called for emergency evacuation, but the weather is too bad for helicopter pickup. They say someone will come tomorrow. I just have to make it through tonight. If you are watching this, if you are the next keeper they send here, do not sleep alone. Always lock your doors. And for the love of God, do not go into the lower levels alone." The video ended abruptly. I stood in that storage room, holding MacArthur's phone, and felt my reality shift. If MacArthur had been evacuated, why were his personal belongings still here? Why had his phone been locked in a cabinet instead of taken with him? And most terrifying, if someone had been living secretly in the lighthouse when MacArthur was here, were they still here now? That night, I did not sleep. I barricaded myself in the equipment room on the upper level, as far from the hidden passages as I could get, with every light in the lighthouse burning. I sat with my back against the wall, a heavy wrench in my hands, listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard them. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the lower level. They were too heavy to be imagination, too regular to be wind or settling structure. Someone was walking through the lighthouse. The footsteps moved closer, climbing the stairs toward my position. I heard them pause outside the equipment room door, then breathing, deep and wet, right on the other side of the thin wood. A voice, barely more than a whisper, said words that I will never forget. "The lighthouse is mine. They always leave. You will leave too." I saw a shadow move across the crack at the bottom of the door, saw the handle slowly turn as someone tested it from the other side. The door was locked, but it was not a security door, just a simple interior latch that could easily be forced. I waited in absolute terror for the door to burst open, for whoever was out there to come through. But after several minutes, the footsteps retreated back down the stairs. I stayed in that room for 3 more days, leaving only briefly to grab food and water from the kitchen when I was certain I heard no one moving below. I fired every emergency flare I could find, hoping someone on the mainland would see them and realize something was wrong. On the morning of day 19, a Coast Guard helicopter finally arrived. They had been attempting to reach me for days after the yacht's EEO radio failure, but weather had prevented any rescue attempt until that morning. When I told the Coast Guard crew what I had found and what I had experienced, They conducted a thorough search of the lighthouse. They discovered exactly what MacArthur's video had shown: an elaborate network of concealed spaces within the walls of the lighthouse, accessed through a panel in the lower storage room that was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The spaces contained months' worth of supplies, makeshift furniture, and personal items. DNA testing on items found in the hidden spaces matched a hiker named Spencer Holt, who had been reported missing in 2017 while hiking near the coast. Further investigation revealed that Holt had apparently suffered some kind of mental breakdown while hiking and had discovered the lighthouse's hidden spaces, perhaps originally built for smuggling in the 19th century. He had been living there for over 2 years, emerging only when keepers were absent, stealing supplies from their stores, and hiding whenever new keepers arrived. The high turnover rate at Stormbreak suddenly made sense. Other keepers had probably sensed something was wrong, had perhaps heard sounds or noticed supplies disappearing, and had left rather than confront whatever was happening. The most disturbing discovery came when divers searched the waters around the lighthouse. They found human remains on the rocks below the cliff face on the north side of the lighthouse. Forensic analysis identified them as belonging to MacArthur. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from significant height, but there were also defensive wounds on his hands and arms, suggesting he had been in a struggle before he fell. The official ruling was homicide. Holt was eventually located and arrested. He was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric facility where he remains today. Stormbreak Lighthouse was decommissioned permanently, the automated beacon maintained remotely, but no longer requiring human keepers. The most dangerous thing in isolation is not being alone. It is thinking you are alone when you are not. MacArthur learned that lesson, and it cost him his life. I learned it too, and I was lucky enough to survive. Always secure your environment and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. If supplies disappear, if you hear sounds that should not be there, if you feel watched in a place where you should be alone, do not dismiss those feelings as paranoia. Sometimes the most rational response to irrational fear is to leave immediately and let someone else figure out why you were afraid.